Hello. Good morning.
Oh.
Oh, can you hear me? I'm just trying to test.
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Can you?
Yeah, I can hear you as well. Antonio, right?
Yes.
Nice meeting you online. We have
Nice to meet you. Wait a second. Let me turn on my camera so you can see me as well.
Okay, hang on. I'll need to try my video. Oh yeah, here. Hello, what's your time over there?
Oh, actually, I didn't specify this, but I'm in Taipei right now, so it's 7:48. So
Yeah.
in the morning. And where are you right now?
I'm in Canberra.
Oh,
10 o'clock in the morning. Yeah.
okay. So not an impossible time, at least for us.
Yes.
So.
Figure I will unmute, otherwise I just feel creepy. Hello to you both.
Oh, a lurker in the shadows. I see. So good morning or good evening or good afternoon.
Yeah, we don't know your time.
I'm in Somerville, Massachusetts, so good evening.
Okay.
Good evening to you.
Yes, it is officially dark here, so.
I'm seeing that the meeting is being recorded. Does that mean it's going to be like available for everyone to watch, or?
No, it's just for the record purposes.
Oh, okay.
We're going to have our assistant to write a summary.
Okay.
And post that summary online instead of the video. So.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice. And good morning to you as well.
Good morning to everyone.
Hello, Chris.
Hello.
Hello, Chris.
Thank you for organizing everything. I mean, it must be a lot of work.
Leo did most of the work. I
okay.
Providing the technical supports.
Yep.
Oh, have another.
So we have someone coming in.
Yeah, more people coming in.
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Is it Leo? I could not see Leo. Is Leo there?
Leo is not here yet.
I see.
Hey everyone. Hey Chris, thanks for setting this up.
You're welcome.
Get it. Good to see everybody.
Most of the participants in this session are in the States, right? About most of look at the program. But the one gentleman, Antonia, is in Vienna, so that's about midnight, right?
No, well. So first of all, good evening to you. And I moved to Taipei before the pandemic, so I'm still in Taipei right now. So it's morning, and so it's bearable.
Okay, well, so that's why
Clever.
I thought
Smart
you
move.
really would brave the small hours, wee hours.
Yeah.
But that's okay. Yeah, Taipei. Yeah. Well, Taipei is safe, I think, from the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, relatively.
How are things in Australia? Austria.
Oh, well, they went through a first lockdown and then a second lockdown, and right now they're slowly reopening.
Okay, that's good. That's better than other European states.
Yeah, true.
Could Leo have some problem? I call you on WeChat, you didn't answer. So you turn on your WeChat, Chris.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So let me call Leo by WeChat and see I can get hold of him. Oh. Hi, Leo. So I was trying to call you. So you appear at the last minute, very punctual. Can you hear me? Hello?
Hi, Leo. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, the mic is mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Now, yeah. We can,
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I can hear you guys very well. We have about a minute to go. Okay, so but I see that almost everybody who will be doing a presentation is here. So that's great. Yeah, all the presenters for this morning session are here. So I guess we can, okay, we can kick off. Maybe Professor Tai, you would like to make some opening remarks?
Yeah, thank you, yeah. Hi, good morning and good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes.
Can you hear me fine?
Yeah, could you?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes,
Okay.
good. Yes, can, yeah.
Okay,
Can Professor Tai make some, yes.
Yeah. So your connection is not that good.
Not that good, huh?
Yeah, I think the other connections are better. I do not know why. And probably, yeah. But anyway, just to save time, I just want to welcome everyone to the symposium. And good morning and good evening, and wherever you are at this moment. But the Zoom make it possible for us to overcome the pandemic and do the symposium. It's regretful that we could not do it in Beijing, but we'll try to do the next year if things improve. And well, let me say something about this program. It's originated with the idea of Professor Yuan's project about the transmission of Chinese culture in the world. It's a very grand project that composes different components. And Professor Yuan and I co-founded the Journal of Chinese Literature and Culture and the Columbia book series, How to Read Chinese Lit. Then he embarked on this grand project covering different parts of the world. Then he asked me to help with the Western world, Europe and America. And then at the meeting, I think 2 years ago, in Beijing, then I proposed 4 to 5 topics. Then they gradually approve. So these are basically the 5 projects we are doing now. We had the first symposium last summer, fortunately, in Beijing, and the manuscript has been completed and has been under review at the Brill. So altogether, 5, the 2, I think, were 2 pairs that are highly comparable. First, the influence of Chinese literature and classics on Western literature. So those, the target of our investigation are the writers in the West who do not know Chinese, but who learn about the Chinese literature and culture from different sources. So that's the Symposium 1. Then Symposium 2 will be held 1 or 2 months from now. That's on the influence of Chinese classics on Western thinkers. So the thought volume. So the two volumes, and Leo and I are working on are the translators, the impact of the translators on the transmission of the Chinese literature and culture. So this symposium is devoted to the translator of Chinese literary classics. So the next one, 1 month from now, will be devoted to the translator of Chinese classics. Okay, the three schools, Confucian, Buddhist, and the Taoist. So that make up 4. And then the remaining one is a kind of an outliner. It's study the impact of Western theory on sinology from the inception of sinology, from the birth of sinology to the present. But we turn out, I think more than half of the paper about the impact of Western theory on the current studies. So because that symposium may not fit this Brill series that well, so we decided to go for the JCLC. So it will be the next special issue for JCLC. The symposium will be held very soon. And so these are basically the 5 projects and I proposed, and I got the support of Leo and Steve Roddy, and then we worked together. Then at the time, I came up with the idea of publishing it in English with a publisher. Then Leo put me in touch with Marcia Hong. Then we talked about the idea. They're very enthusiastic about it. So we discussed and we finished the application process. I submitted a prospectus, and it was approved rather quickly. So at the symposium, the first symposium last summer, so we launched the ceremony, we launched the book series. So hopefully our symposium will be the second or the third in the series. In taking the opportunity of welcoming this opportunity, and I would like to mention that you're welcome to expand your paper into full-length monograph, if that's what your current research focus. Then I will be happy. We'll be happy to consider it for possible recommendation of peer review and publication by Brill. So this is so much information I want to share with you. And going forward, I look forward to working with you. And Leo and I will be very delighted to work with you and to deal with all the issues. And we still hope to be able to see you people in person 1 year from now. Yeah, 1 year from now. Okay, this is all I was to report. And again, I thank Leo for all the efforts, the organizing efforts, and answering your queries and giving you reminders. And we finally get together now in a virtual space. Okay, thank you. Yeah, Leo, and I want to give it back to you. And from
yes.
here,
thank you, Zhongqi. Thank you very much. Well, I'm glad I am finally able to meet with all of you whom I have been corresponding for the past year or so. You remember, originally this symposium was meant for January 2020. So it's 1 year and 3 months, right? Delay. But I'm glad that we are finally making it. So I don't think I should waste any more time, because some of you may be in the middle of the night and you would like to start off as soon as we can. Each presenter will have 20 minutes to talk about his or her paper, and then this will be followed by 10 minutes of Q&A. I hope you will adhere to this time frame. as we go along, I will give you hints as to, when your time will be up. So try to make sure that you can say all that you want to say. And I'm glad that we have already received the papers. So you can also bear that in mind in your presentation, because I believe most of you would have read the papers that I sent out in the past 2 weeks. And already, I hope, with your questions. You remember I sent out an order of a kind of an order of presentation. So I will stick to that. And we'll begin with, if you remember, we'll begin with Antonio Leggieri from Italy. I know it's 3 a.m. for him. So
well, actually, I think you missed that part. So I moved to Taipei before the pandemic, so I'm still there. I wasn't able to move. My compatriot that I see online, Massimo, might be having some problems with sleep right now, but
okay.
But I'm okay. Like, it's 8 in the morning here. Everything's good.
Yeah. So anyway, Antonio has been lucky and he got the first slot. Anyway, we will begin with him. And Antonio Leggieri is a doctoral candidate in languages, literatures, and cultures at the University of Salento and the University of Vienna. The topic of his presentation today is a brief history of the Italian translations of Feng Menglong's San Yan. Now the floor is yours, Antonio.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. I'm guessing if I can already share my my PPT. I'll try and share my screen, and please you tell me if you can see it. If that's visible, then I'll continue.
Yes, for me, yes.
Okay. I see any other remarks. So basically, I'll try and do the simplified version of my paper that you already received, because, well, time is what it is, and we're all in different time zones. So I'll try and not really water it down, but like give a brief presentation of what my paper is about. So as you can see, it's a brief history of the Italian translation or translations of Feng Menglong's San Yan. And I hope I don't have to reintroduce to you for the nth time Feng Menglong and his enormous body of work. Just to mention his writing on which there is critical literature, like recent critical literature in the West. We can mention his collection of songs from written in Suzhou dialect, the Shengyu, which have been published in English. His joke books, especially Xiaofu, which has been published in English too. But if we usually see somebody doing a research on Feng Menglong, he's usually doing research on San Yan, and that's the work that he's mostly associated with. And usually San Yan is mentioned in the same breath, along with Lingnan Chu's Erpai. So it's usually San Yan Erpai. So basically, some ancient prints of Gujin Xiaoshuo, which is San Yan 1, you can say, also called Yu Se Ming Yan, and Jing Shi Tong Yan were rediscovered in Japan in the 1920s. San Yan stories were already, let's say, mildly popular in China because of one secondary collection called Jinggu Qiguan, which was basically a collection of, let's say, the best stories from both San Yan and Erpai. And some people say that Feng himself wound up being one of the compilers. So, so these copies were found in Japan. That's where his stories joined the first, let's say, circulated and we already have people like Japanese writers taking Von Melong as a model. And in Europe, in the 18th century already, some stories from Sun Yan were translated into European languages. I'm thinking German, French, and English too. The very first one appeared in the year 1735 in a volume called Description de la Chine, which was written by a Jesuit missionary, as you can imagine. And they were retranslated and republished in other languages. And basically what happened is that when one thinks of sinology and world sinology and circulation of works, usually you may think that Italy is like among the very first key players. But as for Van Melong and his collection of stories, Italy came much later. So, you know, for example, we got all those all these translations into Italian, and even before that into Latin of the Confucian classics. For example, you have Zhongyong and you have Tao Xue already translated into Italian and into Latin already by then. But Van Melong came much later. So basically, I divided my, let's say, brief history into 3 phases. And I will start with the very first one, which is this one called Novelle Cinesi. I don't know if you can see the image on the right. That is the cover of a book, which I actually happen to have right here. It's a book published in 1922. It's this very, very first print. I managed to find a copy on eBay. But anyway, so I called this very first part Novelle Cinesi and the Bowdlerization of Huaben, because, well, okay, so these stories were published in Italy in 1922. Of course, they are not, so first of all, they are not complete translations. Second of all, they are not translated directly from Sun Yan. They are rather coming from the European versions, which in turn were taken from Jinggu Qiguan. So it's kind of a long process of translation from the source text to the target text. So it is kind of strange to see this person. Well, actually, the name of the translator is Paolo Bellezza. He used to translate from English, from French, and from German, but he was by no means a sinologist, and it kind of shows because he based his work on the stories already available in other European languages, and we've got 9 stories which can be identified as Sun Yan stories. And it's kind of puzzling when we see it from our perspective that he was entrusted with translating these stories, because we know it's a book from 1922, but at that time already, even though it was not let's say it was not as common as it's right now, translation carried out directly from the original was not as rare as one might think. So, for example, the Italian sinologist Puini had already published a collection of 7 stories from the Lontu Gong'an, like the cases of Judge Bao. And, for example, at that stage of sinology, so for example, like one quick note about Puini, he never went to China, even though he used to teach Chinese and Japanese in Florence. He never went to China. He said in an interview that he was not interested in going to China at that time, because all the Chinese that he needed to study could be learned on books. That's kind of the same thing as what Arthur Whaley, the translation of the first edition of Monkey, the abridged version of Journey to the West, had to say. Just, you know, a brief thing that these people share. So anyway, so this Bellezza, this translator, he mentioned that he had already seen other translations of Chinese novels, also retranslated, and especially one book which has gone lost, which I cannot find anywhere. Then we are just a few years away from Fiabe Cinesi, which is basically the first translation of 99 stories from Liao Zai Ziyi, rendered directly from the original by Dr. Nicola de Giura, who was a doctor and a diplomat because he lived in China for many years. So it's kind of challenging to assess the exact source of these stories because, for example, no individual story is actually mentioned, like, you know, the name of the original is not mentioned, but some of these stories, you can kind of understand where they're coming from. So, for example, if you think that a story from Gujin Xiaoshuo could have something in common with Long Tu Gong'an, you just have to look at the names of the characters to see that there is that they coincide with the characters from Gujin Xiaoshuo. And what else? So basically, none of the stories that I just, you know, that I identified that you can see here are retranslated in their entirety, since he prefers to impose his own abridged version. And okay, I said that I hope the irony is not lost, because San Yan were in fact longer and more articulate rewritings of much shorter stories. And so, so like all the stories in Wen Yan that we see appearing, for example, in Taiping Guanji about, I don't know, Zhang Daoling, like, you know, these Taoist immortals were expanded by Fan Menlong, or by someone who signed himself as Fan Menlong. So it's kind of ironic to see them being shrunken once again, and in a different form, in another language. So he justifies his editing with these words that I quoted here, in which he says basically that when we translate from Chinese, we should never aim for a faithful version, because Chinese narrators love to indulge on the same topic in a way which appears flowing to the Western reader. If we then consider the trivial and inappropriate poetry, blah, blah, blah. So he was not fond of the shizi, the poetic intervals between the novels or at the beginning. So he basically removed all of them. And we've got something else to see, that he decides, without being able to read the original, that the Italian readers will surely not appreciate the long structures and the poetic verses which populate the Chinese Quaben, as well as the so-called the storyteller's manner, which is the simulated interaction between narrator and audience, typically signaled by such expression as dear reader when you say Kangguan. And he domesticates the stories by attributing titles with a higher degree of familiarity among the Italian readers. For example, Gujin Xiaoshuo 2, the story of this Chen Shou Chen Yu Shi, is given the title Delitto e Castigo, which had already been the official Italian title of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. So he kind of played the role of the patronizing translator by the book. So, I mean, there is some kind of very abstract similarity between the story of Chen Shou Chen and Crime and Punishment, but I don't think it really justifies it. But anyway, let's move on. I mean, we can go back to this later. And we mentioned his visibility. So he's not an invisible translator. And his visibility is manifest even for an Italian reader who does not read Chinese. And because he intervenes on the text in a really, let's say, immoderate way, and in a really open way, by telling people that he wants to modify the text to make them more palatable to the Italian reader. Okay, let's move on, because basically what happened was that this was the very first volume, which once again published in 1922. After that, a long silence, of course. We had the Second World War in the meantime, and this is the transitional period. Once again, we have a book here which has been translated. Wait, I have it here too. Albeit without that cover. I mean, once again, edition from 1959. It's the same book of stories translated from Chinese into English by Lin Yutang and then retranslated from Lintang's English into Italian. Some people were already, let's say, familiar with Lintang because his name circulated many times about among the names of the candidates for Nobel Prizes in literature at the time. So people were, let's say, moderately familiar, especially in the intellectual circles in Italy. And he appeared as a fictional character in a book. So let's say that basically this version was based on the prestige that Lintang enjoyed rather than the actual interest in the stories. And this edition was translated by who at the time was the official, let's say, already translator of Lintang's English writing in Italy at that time. And this was also a period in which, once again, all the Confucian classics were retranslated into Italian, and also the Taoist classics, some Taoist classics. I'm thinking Zhuangzi was retranslated into Italian directly from Chinese. And then you have other publications which showed a renowned interest of the Italian intellectual circles in Chinese literature. And at the same time, we have a rediscovery and reprinting at the time of the original, let's say, the original versions of Gujin Xiaoshuo, for example, by this publishing house is called Wenxue Guji Kanxing Shi, or Renmin Wenxue Chuban Shi. And I don't have that much to say about these works. They follow not the original book, of course, but they follow the, let's say, the intermediate translation. So for example, this first book that I mentioned here follows almost word by word Lintang's English version. The other one, which is La Camicia di Perle, which I also have here somewhere. Yeah, I've got all these books here. So yeah, it's a very short one. It is just Gujin Xiaoshuo 1, the story of Jiang Xinge. And also it follows the German version, which I was able to access because a copy of that was hidden in the library of the University of Vienna. So we got this much for consideration. We also have got this 3 Chinese short stories, also from the same period, and also from let's say the same German translator. But they're both coming from Franz Kuhn and retranslated from Franz Kuhn's German version. And we also have got the appearance of an early stage of literary criticism, because, for example, this Chiusano that I mentioned here was the one saying that these short stories had potential, and he wonders what they would be like if they were, let's say, crafted by the expert hands of a contemporary European novelist. So once again, it's kind of patronizing.
Antonio, you have 5 minutes.
Yes.
You
I
have
got 5
minutes
minutes,
left.
yes. Okay, so in my 5 minutes, I'm gonna go to the mature period. Mature period is basically, I call it mature because it's basically the era in the, like, starting from the mid 80s, in which, so it's basically, as you have noticed, it goes from 30 years to 30 years to 30 years. But this one has been kind of a continuous period, which started in the 80s, in the late 80s, and it's been going on up until today, because I included myself. So basically, what you see here, if I can show it better to you, this is the title of my own translation of Gujin Xiaoshuo stories from 1 to 14, because of course the publishing house was not really that keen on publishing all 40 stories. But anyway, we got finally translations conducted in the original texts. We got a tendency to which I have seen in all the other works, a tendency to paraphrase the obscure passages. For example, you have this this passage that I highlighted right here, which is in a story from Gujin Xiaoshuo, and you have it. It's really short, and it doesn't say that much if you don't use, let's say, footnotes. So 就是章华不误事，也不过这其一二，于是年的。And etc. etc. And you have even Zhang Hua, who wrote the great treatise Bouzhe, in which he gathers lots of extraordinary things, and of which there is no equal book in the world, blah blah blah, and Yan of the tongue, etc. etc. So a tendency to paraphrase the obscure passages. One thing that I want to show you once again in a text that I have here, which is not my own. I mean, I wish I got to translate this. Was that basically what we have here is a translation of a story about Su Shi's little sister. Su Xiaomei. What happened in this text, if you can see it, is that, okay, so Italian, whatever. Chinese characters, because there is a wordplay, or there is a character play which cannot be explained in any other way than by inserting Chinese characters into the Italian text. And yeah, and also here you got circling Chinese characters, and then of course footnotes over footnotes of explanation and different interpretations of those passages. So I'm concluding. I am, let's say, foreshadowing. So first thing, I kind of foreshadowing a fourth phase in which more translators will join forces to publish all the Sanyan, all 120 stories. At the same time, the question remains of the utility of translating Sanyan into Italian in this day and age, because I mean, people are not really attracted right now to Chinese, let's say, Chinese literature from that era, and if they are attracted to writings from that era, it's usually one of the Sidachi Shu, one of the four masterworks of the Ming era, not really that much for short story, especially because people are really like, some critics are saying that, oh, it's basically just like reading Boccaccio but in Chinese. But anyway, the pleasure that comes from translating from long stories is visible, and as I can see, it has attracted many people over the years, because, okay, one last thing I'm showing you, these are all the books published into Italian that I managed to collect over the years. So I'm guessing one has to imagine the translators happy to work on this material. And I'll stop here because I don't want to overbear you with data and facts. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio.
Yeah.
Well, the floor is open to questions now. Well, maybe you want to identify yourselves when you raise a question. Of course, that is not compulsory, but I mean, just to enable the conversation, to move. Maybe I'll just start by asking the first question. Well, I'm interested in the several references to Decameron in your paper, although you did not quite elaborate on the kind of link between the Sanyan stories and Decameron. You also mentioned some kind of connection of these stories to Brecht's Three Penny Opera, but you didn't elaborate on that either. You say, I'm interested in finding out more about the Italianness of the translations, and maybe that's not one of your concerns, but could you respond to this question?
Yes, so basically, just to elaborate briefly on this, what happens is that, of course, Van Melong stories are not written in what we can call contemporary Baihua. I mean, it is discernible, it is readable, it's understandable by a contemporary reader, but the style is kind of more ornate and more reminiscent of what was the style of his time. And of course, his translators try to imitate some kind of ancient Italian vernacular. So that is one reference to Boccaccio. They try to let's say embellish the language so that it wouldn't sound bland and it wouldn't sound contemporary, but it would sound as something coming from the past indeed. So that's one point. The point about Brecht, I wasn't able to what's it called, to elaborate on the paper because it was just a small reference made by one of the translators who translated one of the stories from German. So he was a scholar of German literature probably, and he got this parallelism between Van Melong and Brecht, of which if you want to, I will look into it and I will try and include something more into my paper. So thank you again for your question. I will let's say elaborate a bit more on in my, let's say, revised version of the paper on the Italianness of Van Melong's translations.
Yes, other questions?
Yes.
Go ahead, Massimo.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I would like to ask Antonio a question. I am Massimiliano Canale. First of all, I wanted to say that I read your translation of 14 Stories of Van Melong and I enjoyed it. And as I do research on Chinese poetry, I heard a comment that you cited from a translator, I think dated 1922, where he said that he didn't translate Chinese poetry in the Huapen stories because it was, and I quote, trivial and inappropriate poetry. Mm-hmm. And I also found in my research for this paper, for this chapter, similar comments on Chinese poetry made by translators up to the first half of the 20th century. That is to say, they usually said that Chinese poetry was trivial, especially song lyrics and song lyrics, which I do research on, and I know there are many in Van Melong stories. So I wondered if you could tell us something more about the translation of poetry in Van Melong stories. And for example, when did translators start to include poems in the translations that they made? Is it just something that they did recently during the mature phase of translation? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question, Massimo. It's a very apt question, and I can see that it's coming from someone who does research on poetry. And what I have noticed is the trend for right now for modern, let's say, translators from the very last period to include poems as much as they can. Of course, one of the translators who I know for a fact he translated directly from Chinese was really fond of translating poems in a poetic form and rendering them in a poetic form. Of course, I'm talking about the man, the legend, Professor Casacchia. And another translator that I found also from the modern era, which I cannot find, like his book is lost somewhere. I've got too many of these things. Yeah. Anyway, he was really keen on he was really fond of reparaphrasing the poems and turning them into short stories, short anecdotes. So you have a short anecdote, which originally was a poem. Then you have the beginning anecdote, from the Hua Ben, which was an anecdote, and then you have the poem, the actual story. So it's kind of a long process. So I would say that it started in the modern period, because earlier, it was like, you know, poems, as you have seen, they were like frowned upon. I was like, oh, wait, there's a story going on. Why does the narrator interrupt the story, interrupt the narration to give us a poem right now? Let's delete this. Yes, I think I received a question in the.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrew?
Antonio, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So I just wanted to follow up. Thank you, by the way, for your talk. Very interesting. I'm you know, as with all conferences, it's like I'm interested in what you have to say because I'm doing the exact same thing. But so to follow up on Leo's question, actually, so I'm working on well, right now, Jinpime, but my next project is Jinggu Qiguan in English, and so my first question is to follow up on the Decameron question, because Jinggu Qiguan is sort of notoriously chaste, right? Like they kind of take out all of the Lingmeng Chu stories that are sexy and funny, and they're, you know, sort of like it's historically been read not as like a collection of the best stories in terms of literature, but the best stories in terms of like what is good for you.
Yes.
But I do like the Decameron, right? Like this is like the 1965 Kenji Watanabe version of Jinpime, right? In Italian, right? And of course, like so I mean, I don't mean to dominate this, but I'm very interested in, you know, world literature. The concept of world literature is new, you know, like 20 years old or whatever. And David Damrosch and all those guys, like they talk about it in terms of essentially either it's a masterwork and is like good in terms of literature, or it is a window onto another culture, and therefore like it is good for you, like, you know, and so my thing, and this issue of the Decameron being raised with Jinggu Qiguan or Fengmanglong in particular is, to me, is interesting because on the one hand, it's not at all accurate. Like there's very little sex in the Fengmanglong stories, right? And but on the other hand, it predates world literature. I mean, it totally predicts the concept of world literature, right? Like come read this, come watch this sexy erotic, you know, like pornographic movie, because it's just in the 60s, right? The 1965, like, because it's just like the Decameron. It's good and it's good for you. So anyway, I was just sort of curious, like, I don't really know what my question is, other than I'm excited and I want to know like what is going on in Italy vis-a-vis the Decameron, right? Like, is it thought of as like, is it something that would sell a book to say like it's the Chinese Decameron, or is that something that's gonna like put that is gonna convince people this is worthy of study?
Okay, very, very interesting question. Thank you, Andrew. And also, you know, it gives you material, like, you know, it gives you stuff to think about. I would say that, well, the Decameron itself was the object of retranslation. In fact, they called it Decameron from one Italian to the other. Basically, they retranslate, yeah, in the 90s, they translated the Decameron into modern Italian. And it sold, as far as I know, it sold relatively well. And as you have seen, as you have shown, we've got a whole series of movies, not only, of course, in Japan, but also in Italy, which belonged to the genre, which was called Decamerotica, as far as I know. So if you know, want to associate that with something coming from the very far east, you may want to you know, I want to say what do I want to say, actually? You know, once again, I got excited too about the topic. It's, you know, too much sex in here, so
well, thank you, Antonio. We don't have time for more questions.
Oops, I'm sorry.
Can I suggest this for the other presenters? If you want to have more time for discussion, you know, to hear about other people's responses, you can cut short your presentation. It doesn't have to be 20 minutes. Okay, so you have a choice.
Okay.
Now we have to move on to the second presenter, Professor Lintao Chi, or Rick Chi, from Monash University. And he is speaking on the Jinping Mei, right? The Jinping Mei translations. I think it's on the publication history, more or less, of the Jinping Mei translations in England. Professor Chi, please.
Thanks, Leo. Sorry, I don't seem to have it says host disabled participant screen sharing. So I'm not able to share my screen.
Okay.
Chris, can you help?
There you go. Now you should be able to.
All right, okay. Okay. So my topic of the presentation today is the monkey journey in the West. It's an archive-based reception study of Arthur Willey's translation Monkey from 西游记. The presentation will be in 5 sections. So firstly, a quick introduction to the use of paratext in reception studies. And then I'll introduce the original publisher of Monkey, the reception of Willey's translation. And afterwards, of course, I'll explore the very underrepresented division of reception studies, which is the selling the foreign rights to the other European countries, which is not as well, initially as positively received as the UK publisher. And similarly with the US as a case study. So in the US, Monkey's journey was pretty eventful. Initially, there were multiple rejections before it was finally accepted by one publisher, a relatively small publisher. And then there will be a quick summary. So reception studies of translated text usually involve human interaction with texts and also interactions between human agents, including translators, publishers, readers, and reviewers. The nature of human agency means that the reading and the use of texts and the pertinent paratexts, such as book reviews, are never innocent acts. In the case of book reviews, for example, only favorable comments on a book will be quoted by the publisher as endorsement of the published text in question. And given the essential role played by book reviews in the study of the reception of the book, such selective reading and use of reviews can have immense implications. So an immediate consequence is that a balanced review containing both favorable comments and critical comments is manipulated to create a singularly approving impression. So in the long term, when the original review becomes less accessible to the public, particularly the future generations of readers, this manipulated picture of how the book was received by its contemporaries would be taken or mistaken for the entire reality or the whole truth. So one reason why this actually happens is that paratexts, due to their complexity and diversity, are susceptible to misreading, manipulation, and reconstruction. And that reception studies rely very heavily on paratexts. Paratexts, of course, include peritexts, which is the elements within the same space as the text itself, such as book covers, the annotations, and epitext, which is outside the textual space, such as the interviews or reviews. And Currently, the scholarship in translation studies mainly focuses on translation history in general, or translation process in particular, with the potential significance of archival materials in reception studies largely untouched. So in light of the complexity of archival materials and its academic value in translation studies, I'm trying to explore in this research the archive-based reception study of Arthur Willey's translation of Monkey and its reincarnation in the other European languages. And the archival materials consulted and quoted in this paper mainly from the Allen and Unwin collections from the University of Reading in the UK. Okay, well, that's some of the archives I've consulted. So Allen and Unwin is the original publisher of Willie the Monkey, and they have a long history of a collaboration. So as a renowned sinologist, Arthur Willey is best known for his translation of Chinese poems and classics. In terms of Chinese fiction, Monkey is really the only novel, the only Chinese novel Willey has translated. He completed the translation of Monkey during the Second World War. On 25th September 1941, Willey wrote to Allen and Unwin that he would bring the complete transcript of Xi Yu Ji the following week to talk to Unwin about its publication. A reply from Unwin dated 27th September reviewed his eagerness in embarking on a new book project. So I'm quoting here, "How thrilling, October the 1st is going to be a red letter day. It always gives me a thrill when you bring in a new translation," unquote. So from the tone of Stanley Unwin, we can see that there's an enthusiasm about publishing works by Arthur Willey. From the archival materials, I've found that usually the publisher conducts rigorous reviewing process before accepting a manuscript. And it is not unusual for a submitted translation to be reviewed by more than one expert. And that process usually will take several months. But the publisher's reply to Willey seems to make no reference of any kind to such reviews of Willey's translation. And this is in line with the publisher's very positive reception of Willey's works in general, which can be actually demonstrated in this quote as well. So the publisher's reception of Willey's translation made them to try to persuade Willey to transfer all his works to Allen and Unwin. And their desire to become the sole publisher of Willey's translation of Chinese literary works was eloquent evidence for the popularity of Willey's works among readers and for the publisher's confidence in their commercial success. And with this knowledge of the relationship between Willey and the publisher in mind, it was not surprising to observe how quickly Unwin moved to enter into an agreement with Willey on the publication of Monkey. The publisher received the typescript of Monkey from Willey on October the 8th, 1941. An agreement was prepared 2 weeks later. Again, as I said earlier, there is no regular processes of reviewing and negotiating about the agreement, simply prepared and signed. Monkey was published in July 1942, and the publisher's positive reception was further enhanced by the translation's popularity among the readers and reviewers. Several months after the first edition, Allen and Unwin was already working to bring out a new impression. The table here shows the the number of impressions with the print runs until 1960. Considering the wartime difficulties, such as limited paper supply and the printers being seriously understaffed during the war, the frequency of reprints of monkey was quite remarkable. But the reception of monkey is certainly not a linear process, as I'm going to show next in the next section. In its sales of the foreign rights, the UK publisher was actually found it's sometimes very difficult to persuade the foreign publishers to accept monkey or introduce monkey into their local market. So the exchanges between Anwen with their foreign counterparts really suggest that monkey, the popular reception overseas, was non-linear, was eventful, was an eventful process. The archives include extensive correspondence regarding sales of translation rights into Dutch, French, German, Italian, Spanish, and Swedish. In this section, in this presentation, I'll just use probably one or two quotes to try to show that picture. Anwen actually sometimes employed strategies that may influence or manipulate their foreign counterparts' reception of and their decision about monkey. In an attempt to sell the French rights, Anwen sent the following message to a prospective French publisher. And they say, "We have just sold the Italian translation rights in monkey." So the letter was a gentle but strategic push for the French publisher to make a decision in favor of monkey, thus representing an effort to influence their reception. So they firstly shared the news of the sales of Italian rights of monkey, giving the letter quite positive tone, and then stood in the French publisher's shoes to highlight the difficulties of the time using fairly sympathetic language. And the message concluded with a courteous request for a decision. And that strategy seems to work pretty well. In less than a month, the French publisher wrote to Anwen to express their wish to acquire the French rights in monkey, with the agreement soon striking between the two parties. The main reason why I referred to Anwen's above-mentioned move and message as strategic was that when they employed the sale of Italian rights to persuade the French publisher to purchase the French rights of monkey in 1948, the Italian rights had not actually been sold. In fact, the Italian rights of monkey was not sold until 1953, which is 5 years after this message to the French publisher. So their communication with that Italian publisher suggests that they've sent monkey to an Italian publisher for consideration of publication in July 1952. And this correspondence suggests that more than 6 months have elapsed when Anwen was still waiting for a reply from the Italian counterpart.
You have 5 minutes left, Rick.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Leo. And okay, well, if I'm only having 5 minutes, I'll quickly show, well, that's certainly show it's not a linear process, and their European counterparts do not share the original publisher's positive reception of monkey. Well, the story is even more complicated when monkey was introduced into the US, because there were multiple rejections. Given that there are no translation or retranslation was required, the sales of American rights commenced well before monkey was published in the UK. But as we can see here, from a message from the publisher to Arthur Whaley, they were talking about finding an American host publisher and also about the rejection of it by Houghton Mifflin, and then was offered to a Macmillan company. And this was January 22nd. So a reply was not received until quite late in the year, when Macmillan company actually rejected Monkey. And then since it has been offered to a few other publishers such as W.W. Norton Company, Knopf, which published some other of Arthur Willie's translation, and it was similarly rejected. And after multiple rejections, it was eventually accepted by a relatively smaller publisher, John Day Company, which was specialized in Oriental literature. So, okay, I'll probably just quickly move to a summary by revisiting reception studies or the use of archive materials in reception studies. So it's essentially studies of human interaction with the texts. And between the two variables of human agents and text, it's more tempting to consider that texts are given and as something to be approached, to be decoded and interpreted by human agents. It is true that human agency is notoriously dynamic, but texts, particularly the paratexts that are used to inform reception studies, are similarly capricious. So this is especially true of historical studies on the reception of translated texts. Over time, paratexts that continue to be publicly accessible tend to be those in line with the dominant reception of the text in question. If a book's reputation is well established among its readers, the disapproving critical comments on the book, which might be available at the time of the book's birth, will gradually actually become peripheral until ignored by the audience. So the paratexts that are left for public consumption would therefore create an illusion in the future generation of readers that the reception of the book was linear and uniform. So this is actually the value of archival material in reception studies, because it can really make a significant contribution in reconstructing the multi-layered, multi-leveled, and multi-dimensional reception of text in a given historical period of time. And this case study actually demonstrates that reception of Willie's Monkey was by no means linear, uniform, or consistent across all locations by all agents and at all times. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rick. Questions from the floor? Andrew?
Oh, thanks, Leo. So hi, Rick. It's really great to see you for the first time after all of our correspondence. So I have a couple of questions that are in no particular order, but I guess number one, thanks again for a very interesting talk. I share a lot of your interests. I guess the first question I have is has to do, like you mentioned, or like there was someplace in your PPT about Husserl's cultural capital and the sort of the use of like the British publisher's use of his cultural capital. And I was sort of curious, I mean, again, if you don't know, like we'll talk about this over coffee someday, but like, I'm sort of curious, like what was there a lot of cultural capital in England for Husserl? I mean, like I know, you know, in States, obviously he had a big academic presence, but again, like these publications, you know, Whaley's Monkey seems like for a pretty popular audience, you know, and then that, and so I'm sort of wondering, like, would a reader have even known who Husserl was or cared? But then secondly, you know, one of the things that Husche says in his preface, right, is like, oh, Whaley's translation is so good, it's super accurate, but he does leave out some of the best episodes. And I just noticed on that one cover, Alison Whaley is the one who did the abridgment. Like, who is Alison Whaley? And like, does she get crap for her terrible job of abridgment? Like, what's going on?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Andrew, for your questions. It was great to meet you and the others after so many email exchanges in the last year or so. So, well, with the Husche's cultural capital, it's not so much about his cultural capital in the UK. It's really, this is the usual, really about his cultural capital and the use of it in the US, because that section is really about Monkey's introduction into the US literary market. When the John Day Company finally purchased the rights of Monkey, they've repackaged the whole book, replaced the original illustrations, and also invited Husche to contribute to the introduction to the US edition of Monkey. Of course, Husche's introduction itself is multi-layered. There are some very favorable comments, recommendations about Whaley's translation, and there are some, well, sort of sugar-coated critical comments. And furthermore, as you can see from the last page of the published book, there is a note from Husche. Actually, he proposed some changes, different translations from Whaley's original translation, and that's really more critical comments. We don't usually see that included in the translation. So, well, that's really the use of Husche the capital in the US market. And as you have observed, so Husche was pretty well known in the United States at the time as the ambassador from China to the US. He's, well, he certainly have some enjoyed popularity and influence there. So that's the question about the capital, not in the UK, but in the US. And then Alison Whaley abridged the translation of Arthur Whaley. So he's the widow of Arthur Whaley. So she certainly had much more knowledge about Whaley's translation career and all his other works than the others. And she's in a very privileged position to translation. And that's that one has actually been pretty popular and reprinted quite a few times. And as it says in the blurb, it's intended for the children. So as a children's book, basically.
I mean, this is fascinating, but thanks very much, Rick. We'll have to talk more about this over a couple whiskeys.
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, Sarah, you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much, both for calling on me and for your talk. Like Andrew, I am fascinated by Alison Whaley. I would love to know more. Is there correspondence with her, like in the same way that you have for Arthur Whaley? Was she able to sort of capitalize on her relationship to get them to give her the contract to abridge it? I would love to know more about her. And with that, I wonder if you could say any more about Arthur's relationship with the publisher, because you mentioned that, so for example, his translations didn't have to go through peer review. It was very quick. I'm wondering if he benefited or capitalized or used his relationship to his advantage beyond this. So beyond simply not having to revise anything, was he able to sort of leverage this in getting other translations through, or did he have any financial benefit from the fact that they clearly wanted him? I would love to know more about their relationship.
Okay, well, thanks for the question. Yes, they certainly have a very good working relationship with each other. But apart from that, Arthur Willey seems to have a very close personal relationship with Sir Stanley Unwin, who is the actually responsible for the operating of the at the time as well. So their exchange, you can see that sometimes go beyond professional relationship, talking about publication and printing of the books. They exchange notes about their personal life as well. And Arthur Willey even asked Unwin to find a job for the son of his brother. So, well, this might say something a little bit about what you said about financial aspects of the relationship as well. Arthur Willey didn't seem to ask for any favor in terms about any books, but he worked a lot for Allen and Unwin as an advisor. So he advises a lot about the publication of the acceptance of translations and evaluate whether a book is worthy of publication, worthy of translation into English and publishing in the UK. One example is Robert Penn, and you are living most of the time in the US, published also with Allen and Unwin at the time. And he prepared a translation of Chinese poems, which is a very heavy book, very thick. And Arthur Willey advised that the first 100 pages also should be deleted from the manuscript. And part of the reason we assume is that overlaps with Willey's own interest and with Willey's own translation. So from the earlier times of the Chinese poem. But that's another example thing about their relationship. So the publisher usually accepts Willey's advice and comments without any second consideration. It's not like with the other expert advisors. Usually they will get a second opinion.
Yes. Could I ask a question? Rick, I think this is important material that you have dug up, and allowing us to look at the publication of Monkey from a different angle. But I am wondering what exactly do you understand by reception study? You see, when we talk about reception, it's usually the response of the reader to a work being read. But in this case, it's more like the reception of Willey rather than the reception of Monkey, because it has not been published yet. And you see the publishers making decisions because of the popularity of other translations by Willey prior to Monkey. So I don't know if that is also your understanding, that reception study is actually concerned with the reader's response rather than the publisher. So if you want to talk about the reception of Allen and Unwin, it will be a kind of indirect reception rather than really, reception that we normally understand it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, Leo, for that question. It's certainly that there's a fair point there, and this is exactly also why I think the archives should be studied, should be brought into translation studies, because well, for one thing, so the publisher, if they decide to publish the book, they certainly need to evaluate it. As you said, for Allen and Unwin, it's probably based on their prior relationship with Willey, and also with Willey's success history with the commercial record of his previous translations. But with these other publishers, like the foreign rights, the sales of the foreign rights, and particularly also about the US market, these are really about the publishers as privileged readers. This is still reader response. And by this time, the book, The Monkey, has already been published. And their decision could really be based on the evaluation or their rating of the published book. For their own market, of course, this is a different story, because they need to evaluate the English translation and make a decision based on their reception or their evaluation, and then translate that into their own language and publish to make it available to the local readers.
Okay.
But yes, as well, I think I should probably highlight that the publishers really, they are a privileged reader, and this is also a type of reader response, but not in the traditional sense of the term.
Okay, well, thanks, Rick. We'll have to move on to the third presenter, Dr. Fan Shengyu, of Senior Lecturer of Chinese Studies in the School of Culture, History and Language at the Australian National University. And he is going to talk about rewriting the story of the stone, detranslating David Hawkes for a Chinese-English bilingual edition. Shengyu.
Yes. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll start sharing my screen. Just a minute. Can you see it all right?
Yes.
Okay, good. First of all, thank you everybody for giving me a chance to share. Sorry for such a long and windy title. Rewriting the story of the stone, detranslating David Hawkes for a Chinese-English bilingual edition. Now, the whole, I mean, I wrote the paper that I'm presenting today about 2 years ago, when Beliot was contacting me to ask me whether I'll be interested in participating this symposium. And I said yes, because I was in the process of putting together all the notes and work that have been done while I was preparing the bilingual edition of Honoma, which was published in 2012. So that was about 9 years ago. So since then, I've been thinking, like, what can I do to put together what I've learned in the whole process. And I was putting together everything to get at that point, and I finished writing the paper today, 2 years ago. But since then, I've been thinking, like, what I can do to put the whole thing together. And this is what I come up with. I'm about to finish. It's a book. I want to put the article into a big picture so that everybody know what I'm doing. So the tentative title for the book is called The Translator's Mirror for the Romantic, David Hawkes at Work. I want to find out, like, why and how David Hawkes successfully translated a Chinese novel into an English one. I think the main thing of the book is that, my argument is, like, David Hawkes is actually writing an English novel by itself. So the whole book will be focusing on 3 stages of David Hawkes' work. The first one is reading, and the second one is writing, and the third one is revising. The first chapter is focusing on sinology as foundation, because in my opinion, like, in order to be a successful translator, first of all, you have to be, if you are translating from Chinese into English, you have to be a sinologist. The second chapter is about construction of base text, because particularly when scholars are dealing with classical Chinese literary texts, they need to pay attention to what kind of addition they are using and how do they solve all those textual problems when they, even before they started translating. And the third chapter, I want to focus on sound, shape, and style in translation, because, like, normally when we talk about translation, when we evaluate a translated work, we tend to judge, whether it's successful or not, or whether it's accurate or not. But I think my reading of David Hawkes' work reminds me that actually the audio and visual effect of the translation sometimes will be very, very important for the reader's understanding of the text as well. So that's the focus of the third chapter. And then the fourth chapter is about playfulness and imagination. What I want to say is that, actually, Cao Xueqin himself was a very witty writer. He's playing, literary games with his readers all the time. And if you want to be successful in translating Cao Xueqin, you have to be a playful writer or translator yourself. So that's the fourth chapter. And then the fifth chapter is about the manuscripts and notebooks. I want to talk about, the key to good translation is revision, because translators, like writers, they revise all the time. So the last chapter is about Western literary allusions in a Chinese novel. And this, I think, somehow echoed to and what Antonio was talking right now, because he said, all the Italian translators, some of them at least, were trying to echo, Decameron. I think that's something literary translators need to be particularly paying attention to. So that's the whole picture of the book. And my paper was originally the second chapter here. So what I'm going to talk about today is the textual problems, the construction of base text. So before we talk about Honglumen, and before we talk about Honglumen's English translation, we need to first of all understand which Honglumen are we talking about. So the versions of Honglumen basically can be divided into two groups. As we can see from the shadowed pies here, one is what I call manuscripts, the other is what I call printed versions. They are overlapping with each other. But David Hock's translation, which I call P, means published by Penguins, sometimes follows manuscripts, sometimes follow printed edition, but sometimes he follows neither of them, none of them. He basically came up with his own solutions and creations. You can never find any basis in either the manuscript version or the printed versions. If we put the picture into a clearer, outline, it will be something like this. This is Cao Xueqin, and the other end is David Hock's. So he tried to read all the editions that he can collect at that time and came up with his own solution. And this is something fascinating. Since a long while ago, when I was first studying studying the David Hock's translation, I've been fascinated by the issue is what kind of editions he was following and why. Now, I borrow the concept of what I call translation as rewriting in this paper, but I want to emphasize that, actually editing of the bilingual edition lies in two kind of issues. The first one is we need to know that translation is rewriting of the original Chinese into, of course, this is what done by David Hock's. But what I'm doing what I have done in the bilingual edition is trying to rewrite the English translation back into Chinese. But it might sound a little bit redundant and unnecessary at the beginning, but actually the aim of doing this is to try to come up with an authentically bilingual edition. And I haven't decided, whether I should use rewriting or detranslating or back translating. I'm not sure about that yet, but I think the meaning probably is clear here. In order to understand the aim of the bilingual edition, we need to answer three questions. First one is, why do we need a new bilingual edition? Because back in back in 99, in the last century, we already got one. In 2003, another one coming up. But if you look at these two so-called bilingual editions, you will find that actually the Chinese text does not match the English translation. Well, I mean, not 100% at least. So after my editing and collating of the bilingual edition, I think I can safely conclude that, I want to agree with Professor Dong Minfei. He said that, David Hock's is a rare example in the history of literary translations. He's kind of like both a creative writer and at the same time a rigorous textual scholar. So this is something I think, worth analyzing, worth further analyzing, because I don't think many people have noticed that. And there might be some articles, but not much, not many yet at this point. Another question is like, why did I use editorial symbols? And I used 3 kinds of symbols: angle brackets, square brackets, and curly brackets. Now, I've seen some reviewers criticizing me, like, for using editorial symbols. The reason being simply, I want to draw readers' attention to these textual variants. They serve as kind of a road sign to alert readers, there is something going on here. Because, this is a bilingual edition. And if I got rid of all these editorial symbols, I don't think, it will be helpful for the readers to understand what David Hawkes was doing. Well, it's not necessarily what I was doing in the bilingual edition, but I want to draw readers' attention to what the translator was doing at that time. So the aim of the bilingual edition is to help readers to see clearly the ways, in which the translator dealt with his source text. But I need to emphasize that, sometimes David Hawkes was successful, but, as we are all human beings, sometimes he made mistakes as well at the same time. So this is the first question. And then the second one is like, who is the bilingual edition for then? Why do you need to put up such a bilingual edition together? Now, I borrow a quote from two other translators, Shengyu and I think it's George Kao, from the Taipei people. And this is what they said. Like, the aim of the bilingual edition is to help those bilingual readers who are interested not only in reading the stories, but in seeing how well they have weathered the sea change from one language to another. I want to borrow another quote from a scholar, I think he's a textual critic, Chilorowski. This is what he said. Establishing a text is far from being a mechanical job. On the contrary, editing cannot proceed without interpretation or commentary. In other words, like, if you're not sure what is going on at that time, it wouldn't be able for you to edit the edition at all. I want to use 2 examples, because they are so clear, so that, you may understand what I'm talking about. Now, if you look at the Chinese and the English translation here, you will immediately see that, there must be something going on here. Because anyone who learned Chinese for one day would know that, 3 is not 4, right? So what was going on? I checked all the editions that David Hawkes used, and all of them said Sanren. It turns out that, David Hawkes did not make a mistake. The one who made the mistake was the original writer, Cao Xueqing himself. Because according to the story, there should be 4 women here at this stage, not Sanren. But unfortunately, all the editions carry this mistake. So this is what David Hawkes said, like, his comments for Cao Xueqing. As regards ages and dates, indeed, almost anything at all in which the numbers are involved, Cao Xueqing is a translator's despair. Probably, I suspect, because he was just not very good at figures, the sort of person who can never count his change. And if you look at the indiscrepancies in the original Chinese text of Hong Lou Meng, you will agree that, the ages of people, the ages of certain characters, they do not match with each other. Like, at one time they were 9, and the other time they were 13, for example. So this is what David Hawkes called Cao Xueqing. He said he's our OFA, our forgetful author. In other words, like, he's not very good at numbers, at least. Another example is this one. I think it's a bit too embarrassing to read it out loud, but you can see that, David Hawkes' translation was as daring and as shocking as the original. But if you compare with that of the other,
5 minutes left, right?
Yes, I'll be very quick. If you compare with the translation of another pair of translators, you will see that, they are totally different. So in this sense, what I want to say is, like, if you judge, like, if you say that Yang Shengyi did a very good job in avoiding to translate the original text, I don't think that's the true story, because their translation was based on a different one. Now, this is my task in a bilingual edition. I'll just skip it because I don't think that's very important. And what I want to emphasize is about the detranslating or back translating, if you allow me to say so. What do I mean by that? I want to say that, by detranslating, I want to somehow come up with the words and expressions used by Cao Shijing himself to translate David Hock's English translation. For example, these are the titles of the 5 volumes. And all the Chinese, all the 5 phrases here were taken from Cao Shijing's original work. This is what Professor Mackenzie, he's a textual scholar. This is what he said. The text is always incomplete and therefore open, unstable, subject to a perpetual remaking by its readers, performers, or audience. Now, what does he mean by that? If you look at Honorman's edition, different editions in recent years, you will see that actually not only translating a classical work, but also the editing of a classical work is an ongoing process. Okay, I think I'll stop here because I want to leave some more time for discussion if possible.
Yes, thank you. Questions from the floor? Yes, Andrew?
I don't mean to dominate the conversation, but thanks so much, Shengyu. You know how you and I share so many of the same interests as well. So let me just say thanks very much for your talk. I love the concept of detranslating. I love it. And for me, this is very personal because I decided to go to graduate school and study Chinese literature because of the Hock's translation of Hong Meng. And of course, once I got there, and every day since, I wrestle with the fact that it's kind of a different book. I mean, it's a wonderful book, but yeah, I mean, there's so much that is different, and I sort of, well, it's an identity, it's a bit of a cognitive dissonance, but I just wanted to say that I love the concept of detranslating as a sort of coming of age for a scholar. Like a translation is an introductory text, right? Like it's a gateway text, right? And then for those of us who actually go through that gateway, it's like Jungian. It's like you become alienated from it. Like I'm almost mad at it now, because I have written so many papers quoting Hock's and then gone before your edition, obviously, which has made life way easier, to find the original, and there's nothing in it. Like it's not there. So anyway, it sucked me in, and then it disappointed, and then it like completely betrayed me. Anyway, so I love detranslating because I feel like it conveys that sense of sort of almost righting a wrong. I mean, I don't know I know we have Italian participants here, but there's that Italian phrase, right? Traditore, whatever, the translator's betrayer. And I almost like, I love that. And I just feel it all the time. And I love the concept of detranslating as sort of capturing that scholarly alienation from the thing that got you into this mess. Anyway, thank you. Thanks very much. I'll shut up now.
Thank you for your comment. I want to emphasize that David Hock's is a very unusual example, actually. I mean, like in my understanding, like I must say, like he probably is the best example of translating Chinese literature, if I'm allowed to say so, if I'm not too much biased. But the thing is, like you just can't imagine how much work he put into the whole thing, the whole process. I mean, I read all his manuscripts. These are not all available online. I spent like 4 or 5 months reading through the manuscripts, and you can see that he's constantly changing his mind, revising, even to one word. He will start with A and then turn to B and C and D and then E and then come back to A again. Because the evidence are all there, like you can, like the amount of work that he put into it, it's just absolutely amazing. And I was trying to tell that story in the book that I'm working on. Like, I want to present not only what, but also why and how he did it.
Anyway, thanks, Shengyu. I can't wait to read your book.
Hi, Shengyu, I have a piece of information published for you. And I just probably 2 weeks ago, I received a letter from John Minford, requesting the permission to reprint the David Hawkes' notes. The Center for Translation Study at Lingnan published probably 10 or 15 or maybe longer years ago.
You mean the notebooks that David Hawkes
the notes of translation. And now the Beijing Sanlian is republishing.
Oh, really? Really? Okay,
so
great.
That would be a great piece of information for you. And then probably that will also help to boost the sale of your bilingual edition. Because
Thank you so much.
The notes and things demonstrate the kind of labor the translator, went into in rendering that spectacular, fabulous book. Yeah. So, yeah.
I look forward to that.
I'm very impressed with your presentation, the kind of work you've done, and that's really interesting. And is it already published?
No, not yet. I'm still working on it. I'm working on the last chapter.
So by which publisher?
Routledge will be the publisher.
Oh, so it's not.
I haven't signed a contract with them yet.
Okay, Routledge. Okay, I see. Okay, good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, Antonio.
Yes. So first of all, thank you, Shengyu. And if I may just jump in to comment on something. Yes, I was also one of those people who basically read the what's it called, the English translation made by the Young couple, the Yan Xianyi with his wife, with Gladys Young, and then went on and read David Hawkes' translation. And I was, I don't know, flabbergasted. I was able to notice that it was basically a different book.
Exactly.
And if you go to that, you go and add to that the fact that as late as 2015, 16, last time I checked, when I was in Beijing, the foreign publishing press in Beijing is still publishing the Young's version. I think they're still kind of favoring that over David Hawkes, probably for a question of, I don't know, faithfulness or something. And then you add this. Okay, so this is an ebook version I have here of Schonebaum in Italian. It costs nothing. Like, it's much cheaper than the paperback edition, of course, being an ebook. And also there, it's kind of an abridged version. So the Italian translator did this. She translated only the first 80 chapters, the part attributed traditionally to Cao Xuexin, and summarized the last 40 chapters. And in my opinion, this like the Italian translation doesn't read as well as the English one, especially as David Hawkes' one, but it's kind of really faithful. So once again, we come back to the question of translator as a trader, or as translations seen as women. If they're beautiful, they're not faithful, and vice versa. I'm still thinking, my question here would be, who would benefit from the bilingual edition of Schonebaum?
Okay, your question is who will benefit from the bilingual edition?
Yeah, because so I see you quoted by Xianyong and his bilingual edition of Taipei Ren and etc. Okay, that was like a really nice and really poetic way of seeing a bilingual edition. Okay, so it will withstand the passing from one language to another. Yeah, but what does that mean like practically? Okay. I think, since we are all, language learners, like, ideally,
if you are interested in, if we are interested in literary translation, we should aim at reaching the level of David Hawkes. Like, he's kind of a landmark. He's kind of a example, outstanding example. And if possible, I want to find out, first of all, why and how did he do it? And hopefully, my finding, my discoveries in the process of, working on the book would be beneficial for potential scholars and students alike. Like, like we definitely can learn something from it. Like, for example, I mean, the very last chapter of the book will be about Western literary allusions in a Chinese novel. And I want to trace back, David Hawkes' translation back to what? Back to Shakespeare, back to Milton, back to Robert Burton, back to Charles Dickens, Jane Austen. Like, and all these figures, they are just on the back of his mind. Like, he's always coming up with this, phrases and allusions to this text. And it's a very, what I should say, like, it's not a very easy job for me, because obviously I wouldn't be as well read in Western literature as, David Hawkes or any native speakers. But what I want to say is, like, I think it's an interesting topic for me. This might sound a little bit paradoxical, but The Story of the Storm, although it was originally a Chinese novel, it can serve for me as a kind of reader's guide for Western literature. You see what I mean? Like, it's very funny. Like, you are reading The Story of the Storm, but you are reading Western literature at the same time. It's both. Like, it's what I call the two sides of the mirror for the romantic.
Yes.
So I'm not sure whether that will help, understand. Help me answer your question. But basically, that's what I'm trying to do in this book. Like, I want to say that, Hong Lou Meng and The Story of the Storm, they are two sides of one thing, actually.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, that answered my question. And I love your enthusiasm and how invested you are in the topic. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, on this question of the rationale behind the bilingual edition, I agree with what you've said. It's almost like an attempt to put the translation of Hawkes on an equal footing with Hong Lou Meng's, with Cao Xueqin's Hong Lou Meng, which is the greatest novel in Chinese literary history. But I would like to also go one step further and say that there is, beyond this kind of comparability, there's also the issue of competition too. There's some kind of a suggestion that Hawkes is better than Cao Xueqin, especially as he was able to correct some of Cao Xueqin's mistakes. That's just a comment. I can't find many examples of competition, the translation competing with the original, but I think this could be one. And of course, in relation to your subject, you can talk about canonization, right, of Hawkes, not of Cao Xueqin's Hong Lou Meng, because it doesn't need it. So it's a kind of it's a process of canonization for a translation, which is supposed to be superior, even superior in a way to the original.
I know. Yeah, on the topic of competition, comparing Yang Shengyu and David Hawkes, my personal view is that both these two translators, they never talk about another translator's work. Well, they simply say they are just different. I think that's a very wise position to take, actually. Like, you can always argue that Yang Shengyu's translation is more faithful and more accurate, and David Hawkes being more creative and more readable. But at the end of the day, which one is better? I mean, it's very hard to say. It depends on from what aspect you are talking about the problem, and from what position you are coming forward with your argument. Like, you can always find supporters for Yang Shengyu, and you can always supporters for David Hawkes as well. And with regard to the foreign language press still publishing Yang Shengyi, I think the main issue is nothing else but the copyright, because foreign language press owns Yang Shengyi's copyright, but they don't have, you know, a Penguin copyright. You see what I mean? Like, it would be very expensive for them if they use Penguin's edition. That's my understanding.
Thank you, Shengyu. We'll move on to the next presentation by Sarah Bramao-Ramos, who is Pedagogy Fellow in East Asian Languages and Civilizations, Harvard University. And she is going to talk about the translation of the 三国演义. Sarah, please.
Sure, thank you very much. Can you just give me a second so I can get my screen share going? Okay. Apologies, let me just adjust. All right, how is that?
That's fine. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, as Leo said, the French translation of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, 三国演义. So in 1845, Theodore Pavis's French translation was published. And this was not the first translation of Chinese fiction to appear in French, far from it. And it wasn't even the first translation of Three Kingdoms in French either. That honor had gone several years earlier to Pavis's own Chinese and Manchu language teacher, the chair of Chinese and Tartar Manchu languages and literature at the Collège de France, Julienne. But Pavis was seemingly the first unabridged translation. The volume that he published was intended to be the first in a multi-volume project, one that carefully translated all the dialogue, lengthy descriptions of warfare, and all the details of the battle-driven narrative of the original. And Pavis seems to have been somewhat well-placed to take the task on, for he could read both the Chinese and the Manchu in the edition he was translating from, and he was interested in both history and literature. And it seems that he had some support for the translation. It has an esteemed dedication to a lofty patron, and the printing was done by a well-known printer. But in 1851, when the second volume of his translation came out, all of that institutional support had gone. The second volume is undedicated, and it was printed in Pavis's own home, most likely by his own family's press. So it looks like he had to finance the translation, the printing by himself. And this was the last volume of his project that ever appeared. In total, he only translated the first 45 chapters of the original novel. And these two volumes left little mark on either the academic or literary world in which he moved. In terms of Pavis's own legacy, this particular translation is really not mentioned in those who know of Pavis. It's afforded only a line in his obituary, and scholars and enthusiasts of Pavis, of which there are some, are really more likely to comment on the fact that he traveled to Canada than know that he attempted to do the first French translation of this masterwork of Chinese literature. So what went wrong? Why did Pavis never finish his translation? In looking at the translation itself, one of the first striking things, to me at least, about it are the paratexts. It's the extensive framing materials that he surrounds his translation with that are one of the most notable things about it. And I think you can get a sense of how notable they are just if we talk numbers. So the text of Pavis's translation is 281 pages long, but it begins with 62 pages of introduction. There are 111 footnotes on the text. And then there are 206 individual notes at the end of the book. These notes, these endnotes, take up 56 pages in total. Not only do these paratexts, many of which comment on Pavis's translation practice explicitly, not only do they make it clear that to the reader that what they're reading is a translation, and a translation of one, if not two, Manchu and Chinese texts themselves, they also really reflect Pavey's involvement in the translation. And most of them are working to try to cement Pavey's own singular, seemingly, expertise over the entire endeavor, over the novel itself, and both Manchu and Chinese. So in thinking of the work that the Perry texts are doing, I found it really useful to think of this concept of translation as a form of passing, typically used to describe African Americans pretending to be white, presenting as white, or members of the queer community presenting as not. More broadly speaking, passing usually involves members of disenfranchised groups crossing as members of more empowered groups in order to enjoy certain privileges or to escape persecution. So in discussing early 19th century translations of Chinese fiction, Saint-André applies this to translators, noting that they engage in a variety of passing performances in order to authenticate their translation. In a market in the 19th century dominated by pseudo-translations and amateurs, the use of footnotes and transliterations worked to perform an over-the-top performance of Chineseness. In discussing Stanislas Julien's own translations of his teacher, Saint-André noted that Julien cultivates a similar illusion of Chineseness in his own mastery of Chineseness by emphasizing his ability to mimic both the sound and sense of Chinese writing. Pavey, I think, with his Perry text, is doing something similar, but it's not Chineseness that he's trying to perform. He's trying to pass himself off as a professional academic, a real sinologist, someone with formal training in languages, someone with complete mastery over the text, someone with a deep understanding of Chinese culture and history. Fundamentally, he's trying to present himself as someone he is not. I'll leave the question of whether or not Pavey was successful in his performance for now. I'll return to it at the end, but I think you might be able to anticipate how successful I think he was at his performance. But I want to start first with who Pavey was, as I think this helps illustrate a little bit who he was pretending to be. So born in 1811, he was the second son of a Catholic printer. His family was literary minded, and his elder brother moved to Paris first, Pavey then followed. And between them, the Pavey brothers knew a number of the most esteemed literary figures of the day, including Victor Hugo. And both the brothers were deeply enmeshed within the Romantic movement. So the Romantics themselves, emphasizing emotion and individualism, glorifying the untainted past and untouched nature, looked to places other than France for their inspiration. And Pavey followed. He was really trying to become the melancholic young wanderer that so dominated French Romanticism. He sets off for his uncle's plantation in Louisiana in 1829. And he traveled for quite a bit in both North and South America, returning in 1834 to France to study. And he returns again to travel in 1839. And he used his travels to really inform his writing. So he turned his journal entries and memories of his time in America into this first book on the far left. He published another collection of stories, including tales about Egypt, Canada, India, Peru, and Texas in the book in the middle. And many of these stories, before they were published as standalone books, were published in the literary periodical on the far right. In total, Pavey published over 70 articles in the journal between 1835 and 1865. But even though Pavey did have one foot in this romantic camp, he did do a kind of work that none of his literary companions ever did, and that is learn languages. He had at least some command of English, Spanish, Italian, German, Portuguese, and Hebrew. He studied Sanskrit, he studied Hindustani, and he studied Chinese and Manchu. But even though Pavey did the language work that academics around him did, he did not have much academic or institutional success, though not for lack of trying. It was with Sanskrit that he had the most success, mainly through his association with his teacher, Burnouf. He took up Burnouf's position teaching Sanskrit. So Burnouf passes away, he steps into his teacher's role in 1852, although he ultimately resigned, seemingly dissatisfied with the administration and how he was being treated. Chinese, though, was a different story. He never taught Chinese, he never traveled to China, and he did not inherit any institutional support or positions from Julien. He did, however, engage in some of the work that other sinologists did do. And here, of course, I'm referring to his translating Chinese fiction. So thinking of Pavey's translation of Three Kingdoms within this wider context, we see Pavey taking this translation on while in this in-between space. He had no institutional affiliation. That would not come until 1852. And when it did come, it was in Sanskrit. So he was still very much trying to make a name for himself. Small wonder then that all the paratexts pass him off as an academically inclined expert. And it's to this that I'm going next. So in the interest of time, I'm predominantly going to talk about two of the paratexts that Pavey uses, the introduction and then his endnotes, so the notes at the end of his book. So first, the introduction. And here's where Pavey does the bulk of his work, trying to establish both Three Kingdoms as a work of academic scholarship and of himself as an academic. So the introduction is divided into 4 parts. In the first, Pavey gives a brief account of Chinese history. He details the history of the Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties before explaining how the Qin left the Han their eunuchs, how the eunuchs multiplied and flourished, and how we got to the point that Three Kingdoms begins. This first part really tries to establish that the novel is rooted in history. The second then moves on to the plot of the novel, the story itself. After explaining again that the novel is a historical one, bound by dates, Pavey summarizes the entire story. He walks the reader through all the key moments and all the key figures. He recounts the rise of the eunuchs, the Battle of Red Cliffs. He details how brilliant Zhuge Liang is, among other key episodes. Then Pavey moves to his own analysis. He comments, and this is for the 3rd time now, that the book is rooted in history. But this time he offers an explanation. He says, the predilection for history is a hallmark of the Chinese character. He reasons this could be attributed to the Chinese Empire seeing herself as the center of the world. He explains that the story is formal and traditional, and it makes many allusions to classical works because Chinese writers don't have the ability to let their imaginations run full and free. But this is actually why he says the story should be read. He states that Three Kingdoms as a work should be read because it is so rooted in history and fact. History, he explains, has been so blended into it that it has the character of truth, the authenticity which seduces among the grand historians. So authentic are the details, Pavey claims, that anyone seeking to know China should read it. And as he explains, by walking in the steps of the great captains of this age, we learn the topography of China. We feel the essential parts of the empire. They are the plains, the cradle of her monarchy, which stretches between 2 rivers. And since nothing has changed in this immobile country, the history of an internal war, however far away it might be, allows us to read well into the heart of the Chinese nation. Through his introduction, Pavey orientates his reader towards a very particular reading, indicating to his reader what they should pay attention to, the history and the facts, and what they should not focus on, namely the story and the narrative. Pavey not only strips Three Kingdoms of any literary qualities, he presents it like a reference work. And he also asserts himself as the best mediator for the novel. Before the reader has a chance to experience it for themselves, he guides their experience, cautioning them that they are likely to find it formal and overbearing. They are likely to find the narrative limited. He lays out the trajectory of the characters before the reader has even met them and tells them the ending of the story before they have even begun. And in keeping with all of this, Pavey asserts that the only way to truly read the text is to fully endeavor to properly take on all of the explanatory notes. The reader has to be prepared to not only read the text, but all the extra details. And there's one final way that Pavey tries to establish himself in the introduction as an expert over this novel, and that relates to how he presents himself in relation to the Manchu text. Pavey is not at all shy about having used Manchu to translate. It's actually right on the title page. So you can see here, the title page bears 3 titles. At the top is the transliteration of the Chinese. In In the second one is a transliteration of the Manchu, Ilan Gohun Vitre, and then you have the French. And the placement here is telling, for the Manchu is in between the Chinese and the French, visually showing how Pavie intends to use the Manchu translation as a bridge. It's going to help him get between the Chinese and the French. And he talks about this explicitly in his preface as well. He talks about there being several editions of Three Kingdoms in the Royal Library. But he says the one he used for this translation is one enriched with an interlinear Tartar Manchu version, that is to say, a translation in a phonetic language, faithful and accurate. And he says it's a useful translation. The Tartar translation was of great help. One did not have to hesitate a moment between the two editions. So the Manchu edition that Pavie is referring to here is the Manchu Chinese xylographic print of this. This is on the left-hand side here. So first initiated in 1647, this translation was one of the very first Manchu translations of a Chinese text ever completed. Completing it was quite an undertaking. The final print that was produced in 1650 involved a large team of translators. But Pavie questions the translation. He notes that the Tartar version must never take precedence over the Chinese, which is the original. We consult it, that is the Manchu Tartar translation, for difficult passages, especially ones that are written in the ancient style with great results. Then, when embarrassed by the little too simple syntax of Manchu, or we grasp the words without being able to understand the meaning, we usually return to the Chinese, as it was more logical with the construction of its short phrases, and finally, with the two texts underneath our eyes, and by comparing the image of one with the letter of the other, it is deciphered. So here, Pavie is not only explaining how he uses the Manchu text, but he's establishing that he is going to move between them. He admits it's useful, but he is determined that he is the one to decide when he plans to use it and when he plans to depart from it. And this is where the endnotes come in. I know I have 5 minutes, Leo, before you remind me.
Okay. Yeah.
But I want to talk my last 5 minutes on the endnotes. I should note that the endnotes don't just talk about the Manchu. There are others that provide information about Chinese history and culture. Many are extremely long. There are numerous references to a number of reference works. Many notes also provide the reader with information about places other than China. Pavie's really showing off the breadth of his own knowledge here. He draws parallels between China and an array of different times, places, and cultures. But there are many that do talk about the Chinese and the Manchu. And most of these have to do with Pavie noting a difference between the two texts. So some of these are quite general. Pavie notes that the Manchu it prefers to transliterate proper names and titles and terms, and then he decides, I'm going to do the same. But others are more specific. So he's very quick to note, for example, when he's choosing, when there's something in the Manchu that has led him to a particular translation. So here, for example, he notes that a Manchu grammatical particle is helping him translate. Were it not for the Manchu, he would have ended up with a very different translation. Elsewhere, Pavie tries to demonstrate his knowledge of both Manchu and Chinese by comparing the two languages, but he's not always correct in his interpretation. He routinely attributes meanings to Manchu words that they just don't have. Although in Pavie's interpretation, the difference between Manchu and Chinese appears much larger than it actually is. And in many moments, he calls attention to differences between the Manchu and the Chinese, but he does not catch them all. I don't have quite enough time to go into it, but suffice to say, he does not notice all the ways that the two translations are quite distinct. And with that, there's a lot of notes that call into question Pavie's own translation. Many notes offer alternative translations. Here is a different way of translating it. Here's a more literal translation. Often the notes remark that the original is very difficult, that Pavie has to rely on the Manchu, even though he's already stated that it's not an important text, that it's too simple. Many of the notes admit that he needs it in order to understand the grammar. I realize I've given very few examples here, but there's a lot of notes. The ones I've selected are representative of the whole. Put them together, the notes especially, and what you have is a translation that's very uncertain, a translator who's very unsure, a translator who appears not at all like the very forthright academic his introduction presents him as. Returning then to the idea of translation as a form of passing. While Pavie seems able to pull off most of his performance, for example, marshaling his academic and general knowledge, compiling information from academic texts, and explaining certain details of the story and presenting a clear, forthright interpretation of how it is to be read. Elsewhere, when it comes to the language itself, his performance is very shaky. In discussing the stakes associated with cross-identity performance, St. Andre notes that unmasking a person who is attempting to pass might result in ridicule, social ostracism, persecution, or even violence. And I have to wonder if this might have been the fate that met Pavie's translation. His teacher, Julien, was infamous for his academic rigor and public censure of those who did not produce academic translations or accurate translations. And I have to wonder if Pavie did not anticipate or at least fear this, if his endnotes, his constant offering of alternate wordings are a defense he was marshaling before the blow fell. I will end things there.
Thank you. I heard a bell somewhere. I didn't do it. Anyway, question.
That was my cup.
Wow. Thank you, Sarah. Questions?
If I could just jump in real quickly, Dylan, University of Hong Kong.
Hi, Dylan.
Hi, Sarah. So this was a great presentation. I have a question that might have, two questions actually that might have simple answers, but I'll keep it real quick. First is this question of difficulty. If you put a gun to my head and ask me to translate one of the 4 great masterworks, right? I choose Sangguo, easy, right? Because Sangguo is more Wenyan, it's more navigatable. And I would imagine that his training from Julien would be more Wenyan focused. So I'm curious what he actually found difficult, if there's any real pattern there. Was he just out of his depth, or was there something that he kept running into? And then the second question is, I'm curious if he used, and the answer to this can be no, but if he used this translation of Sangguo to work through maybe the politics of France at the time, right? It's an interesting period in French history that one might think that Sangguo would reflect on. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for both of those, Dylan. As to the question of difficulty, so it's interesting because this was, so his Sangguo translation was his first translation of Chinese fiction. He did also come out with a collection of little short snippets. And that translation, actually, he presents himself as a student. He dedicates it to Julien. He says, if it were not for you, Julien, I would not have been able to do this at all. I am so embarrassed for all the times I had to go to you and ask for your help. He's much more forthright in the introduction about how out of his depth he is. But in Sangguo, he's almost hiding it. And this is where I think the endnotes are really interesting, because it's there you really see him out of his depth. And to answer your question, I think he's just a little bit, uncertain. That said, he does make some interesting choices. So I'm thinking about the Venn diagram of the circles that we were just looking at with hawks. Very often he chooses to depart from both from the Chinese and the Manchu and to chart his own course. So for example, he's very keen to remove all mentions of things that could be supernatural or mystical or strange in some way. He chooses, so for example, when he's talking about how fast people are traveling or how fast horses can go, he simplifies and reduces the number down in both the Chinese and the Manchu to make it a more realistic distance that they could travel. So he's both out of his depth and very keen to intervene when he thinks that something should be translated in a certain way. As to whether he's sort of using this to reflect on the politics of his day, he's also extremely keen throughout to comment when he sees a character acting in a way that's chivalrous, or sort of, he comments several times that a character is doing something in the style of a medieval hero. So he's very keen to find parallels, although he's not maybe as explicit as I think you were thinking of, but he certainly does that work of identifying figures that he can see, being represented in sort of the French canon, if you like. So he does that work. But yeah, thank you for those.
Yeah, thanks. That's great.
Other questions? Yes, Antonio.
Okay, so thank you, Sarah. I really enjoyed the all the work that you've gone through to prepare this. I have a question about what you mentioned with his footnotes. So I would say, like, as it's common practice that usually I would see footnotes in literary texts when there is a particularly difficult pun. And I know that Sangwa is not a text which is famous for its sense of humor or for its use of puns, but I was wondering whether you see a pattern, or whether he was just being defensive by saying, okay, I am translating it this way, but maybe there's another way of translating, which is this other way. Or, I mean, can you elaborate a bit more on the nature of his footnotes? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. So there's two things. So he uses both footnotes and endnotes. So the footnotes on the page itself do different types of work entirely. So one work that the footnotes do, for example, he's very fast and loose with where a chapter starts and stops. He does not follow the original in any way, shape, or form. And he notes that with the footnote. So the footnotes indicate this corresponds to which part of the Chinese text. So some of the work the footnotes are doing are marking what he's sort of doing vis-a-vis the original. And the other thing that footnotes do, to that point, is the footnotes serve as places where he he translates texts he does not think belong in the main body of the text. So he very often relegates sort of what he views as superfluous information, superfluous text, to the footnotes. So for example, when Cao Cao is introduced, he doesn't think Cao Cao deserves a long introduction, so it goes in the footnotes. When the Obey is introduced, he doesn't think he deserves a long introduction either. It goes in the footnotes. So all of the comments about a more literal translation is this, or I found this difficult, that's all at the end of the book. So, and that's almost where I wonder the defensiveness. That's where I sort of see the defensiveness building, because all of those endnotes, they're all together. It's 50 some pages, all as a unit, all saying, here's another way to translate, here's another way to translate, here's another way to translate. But as to the footnotes itself, those are mainly spaces for him to hold information he does not think is important, or to indicate again what he's doing when he starts a chapter, stops a chapter, where he's moving things around.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Well, I'll venture another one. I'd like to know a little more about about French academia in the 19th century. I mean, do you have additional information to supply? I mean, how did people at the time look at academics, and what criteria would they use to ascertain whether somebody is academically, sound? You mentioned at the end of your presentation that he never got recognized as an academic, unfortunately, despite all the things that he did. And what is how was translation viewed at the time as evidence that one is a scholar? I mean, could you fill me in on that, or is that kind of taking you outside of your approach?
Thank you very much. It's a great question. So there's a few things I can say and some that I cannot. So I will say what I can and have to think about the things that I'm not so sure about. But one piece that I think is really interesting with regards to French academia is the place of Manchu within French sinology, because Pavia is using Manchu somewhat, actually quite late within the French academic world. So Julien's successor did not know Manchu. None of Julien's successors did. Julien is sort of the last one who sort of taught both in the formal sense. Prior to this period, Manchu was routinely used by sinologists as a crib in the way that Pavia is doing. But after him, this is pretty much it. So the fact that he sort of, I have to wonder if the fact that he put, this is translated from the Chinese and the Manchu, might not have helped him in the way he seems to have thought, because it was definitely falling out of favor, of use at the very time he was sort of putting it right on the cover of his translation. With regards to where French academia was moving elsewhere, I think Sanskrit, I can speak actually to Sanskrit, because Pavia is pushed out in large part because of his more literary affiliations. He's pushed out because he doesn't do sort of more rigorous philological work that comes into vogue after him. So that's why he resigns. He's replaced by someone who has more of those types of credentials. But your question about how is translation viewed as evidence of academic rigor is one I need to think about, but thank you very much for flagging that.
Yeah. But of course, there was the example of Perrault de Ablancourt. I don't know if you are familiar with his work, his translations, and he kind of acquired quite a bit of academic prestige because of his translations from Greek and Latin. So translations were highly regarded, and you remember the cases of like Mrs. Stasia and so on in France in roughly the same period of time. And so at least translations from the classics, you see, from Greek and Latin were highly regarded in academia. Yeah, so, well, anyway.
Absolutely. And in any event, his teacher, Julien, did translate Chinese fiction, but he was able to put on his title page his academic credentials, right? He didn't have to do Julien's own preface, his own introductions are very short, very, very short, only a handful of pages. His translations have very few footnotes. He doesn't have to do the work. In some ways, his academic standing does it for him. But it's something for me to think about. Thank you.
Well, we'll move on to the next presentation then. We have as speaker Andrew Schonebaum, who is, let me introduce him. Andrew is teaching at, well, he's Associate Professor of Chinese Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. I spent a year there too myself in the 90s, in the early 90s. And Andrew is going to address this topic, dreams of world literature, early translations of Hong Lou Meng and Jin Ping Mei in English. Andrew?
Well, thank you. Thanks, Leo, and thanks, everyone. I'm really, thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I do wish we could all be together in Beijing. This past year has obviously been really strange for us all. And I know I'm not like unique in saying that It's even been a bit lonely, even though I live in a tiny house full of children. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here with you and to see friends, old and new. I mean, as for the new friends, you know, it was great to see Shengyu, who invited me to this great conference in Shanghai when he was in residence at Fudan University, and that was basically the last time I left the house. And it's nice to see Rick, whom I've never seen before, but with whom I've had a lively correspondence, and with whom I have, from whom I have liberally borrowed for my own edited book on Jinping. So I hope to see you both again soon before too many months run off. And as for old friends, I'm really excited to see Wu Fusheng tomorrow. I'm so excited, I'm gonna wake up. Wu Fusheng taught me 4th year Chinese at Brown University 25 years ago. And so if I really embarrass myself here, though, it's not entirely his fault, but it mostly is his fault. Anyway, and I'm although I've never met either Leo or Zongqi in person, I feel very close to you because I spend a ton of time, both scholarly time and teaching time, with your books, and they've helped me enormously, flummoxed me a little bit, and I'm very I'm like reaching out through the text to you. Anyway, and I've been spending a lot of time with you at Saocheng BG lately, and so Leo, I've been reading your book backwards and forwards, and I can't wait to buy you a drink and learn all of your secrets. Anyway, I do hope we can be together soon someday. So you have my paper. If you care to read it, God bless you. Let me just summarize it a little bit. And then what I really want to talk about is like what I'm thinking about changing about it. And mostly I'm talking to Rick here, but I would be very happy to have your feedback from all of you. So, so the paper, and I swear, Rick, I swear to God, I wrote it before your book came out. So I discovered it independently. But mostly I talk about Hongmeng and its sort of early reception, and how it basically argues that, you know, English speakers sort of approached the various sort of early dream of the Red Chamber type translations through the lens of realism. And some readers, you know, I mean, I hope I don't have to like give the usual caveats about like race. I am not espousing these views. I'm just saying what they said. I don't want to do air quotes the whole time. Some readers were impressed, you know, that obviously that the different races and cultures shared human experience, emotions, and even literary genres, you know, I mean, and this is like, we're talking like 1929, 1949, it wasn't that long ago. And, you know, in the literary genres that capture those shared, you know, experiences and emotions. And, you know, and so the way in which, you know, English readers appreciated like Hongmeng and English translation were, you know, mostly as like a sort of surprised, bemused interest in our shared interests, both humane and in the humanities. Others, though, were really hung up on the sort of incomplete devotion to realism, you know, like the interspersal of verse, and much worse. And the thing that everybody really was upset about is the elements of supernatural, like the supernatural elements, with no apology and maybe not even self-awareness, right? So this is the sort of big criticism of like these sort of pre-Yang Xianyin, Gladys Young, and David Hodgson Minford translations, right? But contrapositively, right, and ironically, considering the relative reception in China of Hongmeng and Jinping, right, in the Anglophone world, Jinping is received much more as a like modern, avant-garde, like exciting and hardcore realism like a very hard-hitting, serious modern novel. And obviously, so this is what I want to talk about. This is how I think I'm going to adjust my paper, like add this stuff into the paper, because I don't think I really make the point very well. And as Dylan and Sarah and a number of you have mentioned, that like obviously this is really more about like 1960s America than it is about anything. It's not about translation. It's not about anything else. But really, so as I mentioned earlier with Antonio's paper, like I think that this concept of world literature is pretty new. Like it's a reaction to comp lit, which I suffered through in undergrad, like in the 90s. I was brutal. And then I was so psyched when world literature came around, and it was like, great, let's contextualize things and like knock this theory nonsense off. Anyway, so but really, like so the way in which I'm ripping off Rick, and it was unintentional, I swear to God, is the paratexts, right? And so I'm going to show you a PowerPoint where I'm just looking at like the cover, back cover, and advertisements within these various like Jinping Mei retranslations, severely redacted, but redacted only for the sex, not excluding the sex. It only has the sex scenes, and that is what gave this novel the reputation as being like a serious work of realism, which obviously ironically, but then of course like there's also this constant deference to the highbrow, right, as sort of the Decameron, like and like the constant re-quoting and quoting of the New York Times, that says like the Jinping Mei is a good book. Anyway, so of course, so anyway, so I'm going to show you this PowerPoint, and I'm sort of curious because I feel like what I'm showing you is pretty much pornography. I mean, don't worry, I'm not going to show you any pornography, but I'm showing you books that were marketed to discerning readers, right? In the same way that the preface to like Jinping Mei Cihua and the other Jinping Mei novels are like apologies for the genre, right? Like only people who read it as porn, like they're beasts, like they're bad readers. They shouldn't be reading this book. And so like, but like, interestingly, 300 years later in New York in the 65, everyone is like, this is for the discerning reader, like the good reader who loves pornography, right? And so I feel like they're basically defining world literature like in the back alleys or the back racks of a bookstore in Times Square, 20, 30, 40 years before like Damrosch and all of those guys and like the whole world literature thing got going. So I don't mean to make like extravagant claims, but I do think let me just show you what I'm talking about, and then I hope we can have a chance to like talk about it. As I mentioned, like, so just so we know what we're talking about, when I say world literature, I basically mean either the claim that you should read this thing in translation because it is a masterpiece and it is good literature, or you should read this piece of literature in translation because it is like a window onto another culture and will make you like a better person. It's good for you. So it's either good literature or it's good for you. So let me show you, and please be merciless. I'm happy to hear what you've got to say, and will gladly rip you off too. All right. Is this is the presentation thing? Did I hit the wrong thing? All right. Can you guys see this? Everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay. So I say popular, and spoiler alert, I say popular because it turns out they're not popular at all. Like nobody read this stuff, but let me show you. So a lot of these early, early translations of Jinping Mei, like Clement Egerton, Lao She, all of that stuff, these may or may not be based on those translations, but none of them have the title like Plum in the Golden Vase or Golden Lotus or anything that is remotely related to Jinping. And of course, like this is like the guy with no name. And it is complete and unexpurgated, right? So, and of course it's like 100 pages long. So, you know, but so I assume that that claim is meant to appeal to intellectuals, like people who want to know, or maybe it's just saying like, all the sex stuff is in here, don't worry, we haven't cut it out. But you see it's like mail order, like it's sort of under the table. These are not publishers, these are not like major publishers in America or in the UK or in Paris. But you know, but you've got your usual Orientalist tropes, you know, you've got your you know, ethnically, you know, East Asian person, and you've got your, it's part of Eastern erotica that fits right in with like Kama Hauri and Devadasi and that sort of whatever that is. But basically this quote, I like this quote right here, which is on the back of a 1965 edition of the Love Pagoda. And it says, I'll just read it. I assume you can read it yourselves, but in case you can't, every culture has found its own favorite erotic novel to be sold under the counter, to be whispered about, to be passed on to future generations, despite the constant pressure of censorship and prudery. England had Fanny Hill, France had Justine and Juliet, America had Tropic of Cancer, and even before all of these, China had the Love Pagoda, perhaps the most famous forbidden classic of all time. Now, for the first time, the Love Pagoda is made available to the reader in an unexpurgated English translation. And then you see on the cover, of course, there's like introduction by like so-and-so PhD. So like you want to have your cake and eat it too, right? Like you want the like fetishized Eastern erotica, but you want the classic as well. You know, you want the window into culture and the masterpiece. Here's the actual introduction, and it's pretty accurate. It's pretty good, and it borrows heavily from Whaley's something Whaley wrote. I forget where it comes from, but then of course like the later editions, and I was impressed to see that like there were very many editions of the Love Pagoda. Like 6 or 7 editions from 65 to 87, and the later editions of course just cut out the like scholarly introduction, like let's just get down to brass tacks. But you know, the advertisement in the back of the 87 edition not only like excises the introduction, but is like all about physical love, like order, if you like this book, let me give you the handbook, the actual handbook, as much as Jinping is also a handbook to physical love and to the language of love. You know, like you could have, here's more. And of course, like, you know, we've got this, Rick talks about this in his book, you know, and it like, whether it's, you know, it's Chinese erotica or Eastern erotica, you know, 1001 Arabian Nights, doesn't really matter. But I think if you read the back cover, and, you know, who knows who wrote this copy? I mean, I don't even, this book is not even dated. Like there's no copyright page or anything. And so it's very difficult to know, you know, like how much thought was put into this, or how much it meant to anybody. But, you know, but if you read the back cover, it says, although famous throughout the world for its frolicsome humor and wealth of piquant detail, the history of a rich Chinese rake and his numerous ladies is in reality a highly moral work, right? This is just like Jingyi Mei Xua. You know, it's like it's like this defense, you know, the apology. The dissolute hero gets his just and ironic rewards. Those of his women who are faithful as well as enticing rise to higher estate in the arms of other and better men. Those girls who are wicked by choice rather than by force meet the ends they deserve. All this occurred inevitably as a product of the times, which was what this great Chinese classic was written 4 centuries ago to prove. Its pages pitilessly probe not only the public and private vice of the era, but also the venality of officialdom, the corruption of commerce. The story reaches its climax as the golden horde of Genghis Khan sweeps down from the Great Wall into the heart of the decadent China, laying low the mighty, punishing the wicked, enslaving some women and liberating others, making new heroes. Adventures piles on adventure, symbolizing the ultimate triumph of goodness over perverse, lush immorality. So, I mean, it truly is. I mean, it's almost a translation of the preface, right? To to the Tsuhai version. Whatever, I won't read all of this stuff for you, but you get the idea, right? There's lots and lots of advertisements in all of these novels that basically categorize it as a piece of world literature and a masterpiece of world literature, right? You like it's published alongside. If you like this, check out our other volumes. You know, Paprika, His Majesty O'Keefe, The Private Life of Julius Caesar, Aphrodite's Lover, Memoirs of Casanova. You know, let's sort of like everything from around the world. But what I'm wondering is, like, what is the role that erotica plays in defining world literature, like in the United States, like in the 60s? You know, I think
5 minutes more,
that's my
Andrew.
question. Cool. All right, so you can read all this fun stuff, et cetera, et cetera. That's the big question. I got some more samples for you. Here's the Decameron Oriental. But this cover, which is also in Rick's book, you know, to me sort of encapsulates all of these marketable contradictions, right? Like, on the one hand, you've got the Chinese Decameron at the bottom, the adventurous history of Ximen and his 6 wives. You've got this sort of generic dragon, and all of the like reference that it contains, and then you've got the quote, the New York Times quote from the New York Times Book Review. It's possible that this is the greatest novel ever written. And that is also, so the American version of this same Kenji Watanabe movie, and it was made in Japan in 1965, and it went around the world in the same year, like in Germany and France, Italy, and in the States, it was known as The Notorious Concubines. And you can see, again, this is just like the harem of Ximen Qing, right? It's like, it doesn't really matter what country this is. It's just a bunch of like pretty fancy, you know, exotic women who are like weirdly in bondage, and you've got your scalping and sort of American West violence thrown in there. And again, like, somebody probably made this in 5 minutes, so I don't want to belabor it, but it's banned. It's, you know, it's, you've got the New York Times quote. I mean, you have all the highbrow and all the lowbrow in one breath, right? And that is what Jimpime in English was about, in my opinion, for the first, well, between, you know, Egerton and Roy, that's what it was about. It was about sort of the creation, the early days of world literature. But now I'm going to completely undermine everything I just said by showing you how none of this was actually popular, how like nobody read these books, nobody was talking about these books. This is ancient technology by now, but this is like a Google Ngram, you know, like Google scans all these books, millions of books, and then you can search by word or phrase. And so if you search up like Plum and the Golden Vase, Golden Lotus, Jimpime, spelled a few different ways, you see that like Houses of Joy barely is even like registers on the scale of mentions in print, right? Like there are very few. Of course, though, like, you know, Jimpime did sort of reach a crescendo in the 60s when the Egerton translation was made sort of cheaply available in the States. I'm going to skip that. Okay, this is relative popularity of, you know, the Chinese translations in English, Dreamer of the Red Chamber, and I put Good Earth in there just for reference sake. But Dreamer of the Red Chamber is like most popular, and really nothing, Jimpime, nothing, no translation of Jimpime was even close. And then it gets even worse if you know, sort of zoom out to other aspects of Chinese culture that maybe that Anglophone readers were interested in. So now nothing related to Jimpime even like registers. And then when you zoom out further compared to other translated works, like other long translated novels, you know, it gets worse and worse, right? Like Dream of the Red Chamber still's hanging in there pretty well with you know, like In Search of Lost Time and Tale of Genji, but and this is just to show like relative interest in English-speaking world of like in different nationalities, national novels. But this is what I wanted to end with, and I'm just sort of curious, like we see a spike in this concept of world literature in the 60s, right? And then it tanks relative to comparative literature, but then it bounces back in the late 2010. So this, I think, is the thing that sort of speaks to what to this weird congruence of paratexts of these like pulp versions of Jinping Mei translations and like serious scholarly definitions of world literature. So I'll stop there because I'm curious to know what you guys think, and feel free to tell me.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks very much. Rick, come on, you got to tell me, how mad are you at me right now?
Well, thanks, Shengyu. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. It's great to to see these familiar covers again, and I really love the your graphs towards the end to see the whether and how people read these works. And very interestingly, I can see Dream of the Red Chamber pretty high in the rank, meaning that it is one among the most read Chinese novels in English. But very interestingly, my colleague and I, at the moment, looking at the reception or the translational history of Chinese novels in the Japanese context. Well, the Three Kingdoms seems to be the most read, and Jinping Mei is also having more than a dozen Japanese translations. But the Honglou seems to be not really popular. I mean, not proportional to its reputation in China, not even to its popularity in English. So in Japanese, there seems to be fewer translations and fewer adaptations in comparison to the other Chinese novels. Well, in particular, the other masterworks from the Ming Dynasty. So, well, back to your world literature discussion, I think it's really interesting to conduct some not only bilingually but multilingually, so across different cultures, to see these same works, how they are read, translated, received by different cultures, and that might add some depth and breadth to what you are looking at the moment in this presentation, I think.
Well, thanks, Rick. Yeah, I mean, it's a little embarrassing because I don't go really into translation at all, and the idea of reader reception is so like fusty and kind of so 20th. As my children say, Dad, you're from the 1900s. So I feel like that's sort of reader reception too, but I do think that like these digital humanities do give us like a little window into what we're talking about. I mean, I think, yes, on the one hand, there was kind of a world literature impulse in the 50s or the 60s, and a sort of awareness that it's okay that everybody, in the same way that I'm talking about like the early reception of Honglou, and everyone's like, yes, the Chinese also have feelings, like it's incredible. But in the 60s, it's sort of like, I think eroticism or the erotic literature, and obviously, I mean, I have a lot to learn here, like I haven't read the literature, but it is in somehow, like it somehow is like a language, like a language, like in the way that plot is easy to translate more than, like feelings. Eroticism is easy to translate, and it makes it seem very universal, right? Like, and so I think that there is that sort of early impulse. I think we're learning, we can learn a little bit about. Well, I mean, I talk about like the very earliest translation, right? The Adventures of Xi Mingqing, which was published privately, and like, and the Vice Squad like enforced, like jailed booksellers for selling it in New York, and like I've got like 5 editions of it. But that translation is actually very eloquent. Like it's beautiful. So I'm sort of curious about this sort of melange of high and low brow, and the way in which it sort of figures contemporary discourse about world literature?
Well, the 60s is definitely so during the sexual revolution, it's the golden era of erotica. So, and as well as the literary censorship is still in place at that time. So I guess that's sort of about the highbrow and lowbrow, the coexistence of the two in the paratexts.
Right. Well, and it's not just the golden age of erotica, it's the golden age of defending reading erotica, right? Like yes, I'm a discerning reader, like I'm not just some sort of disgusting guy off the street. Like I'm a reader of note. Sorry, Sarah, please.
No, I mean, I am at heart truly a book historian. So I study history of the book. That's what I do predominantly. So I was interested in sort of your note that nobody was reading these things. You can sort of tell that by looking at Google Ngram, and that to me doesn't seem to square with like the material form of the pulp versions you're looking at. These like mass market, cheaply produced, cheap to buy things. So I'm wondering if there's not more there to do with the publication history or the publishers, everything surrounding those objects, because nobody read them. I'm wondering if there's something that Google Ngram is not capturing in I'm not surprised that there might not be mentions of them. But if you show me that sort of cheap mass market book, I would assume there were lots of copies of that. So I'm wondering if there's something not squaring. I'm sort of intimately reminded of Radway's Reading the Romance, which is all about reader responses to romance novels, Harlequins, which again, mass market, cheap things, probably a lot of those titles wouldn't come up in Google Ngram, but she has lots of evidence of lots of readers reading them. So I'm curious about the publishing side of things, other titles, the cost, the distribution. I'm interested in that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think we'll never answer it because these publishers came into being. It's like 1910 Shanghai, where these publishers came into being and disappeared and then reinvented themselves like 2 doors down the next day. And so these publishers came and went, but the translation's the same, right? Houses of Joy, Harem and Shimating, they're all the same. It's just these sort of the covers are different, the sort of introduction is different, the ads in the back are different. And yes, you're absolutely right. Of course, there's a reason why they're not appearing in Google Ngrams, right? It's because it's porn. They cut out everything but the porn, right? And who's going to be oh, I read a delightful masterpiece of porn the other day, so yes, they're not being reviewed, right? It's not being written about. And so you can definitely see that, but you can also see that it's not really achieving masterwork status as the back of the cover claims, right? Because if it were, because obviously there's that one quote in the New York Times, and probably half of the references to Jimping Mei in Google Ngrams are to that single quote that just keeps getting repeated and repeated to justify the porn. But I just keep coming back to this fact that when you take a giant book that is clearly a masterwork and you cut out everything but the thing that it is censored for in its native language, you get what is a very popular, very avant-garde, very chic, contemporary, speaks to people, modern American novel, that people are paying $1.75 for and having sent directly to their offices so their wives don't see it.
In defense of the New York Times review, I'm deeply reminded the Manchu preface to the Manchu translation of the Jimping Mei promises that in 100 chapters there are 100 prohibitions. It will tell you in each chapter something not to do. So it too presents it as a good book. But that's
discriminating reader will know the difference.
100 things not to do in 100 chapters.
That's
Sorry,
right.
Side note.
That's right. Exactly.
Well,
thanks, Sarah. That was very.
Yes,
that was
thank
great.
you, Andrew. Makes me, your presentation makes me think about really big issues like what's world literature, you know, is it an elitist concept? That's something, yeah, that I've been, yeah, I've been thinking about, and you have aroused my interest in that too. But anyway, we've run out of time in your case, and we have to move on to the last presenter, Daniel Yode, Professor of Modern Languages and Literature at Beliot College. And he is going to talk about, well, a different novel, the Yi Jiao Li. So his topic is the double effect of translation in Yi Jiao Li, or the deux cuisines. Daniel?
Thanks, everyone. I'm well aware that I am now standing between people in bed or people and lunch or anything other than another Zoom presentation. I'm sorry for that. I'll try to make it as interesting as possible. I've really enjoyed everyone prior to me presenting. I've been taking little notes, and I think I'm going to adopt a similar strategy to Andrew and assume that if you wanted to read my paper, you could read my paper. And that I'll give a little bit of an overview of some of the issues there, but then I want to talk about some of the things that I didn't put into the paper, but that are tangentially related to this topic, and that also I think might connect to other people. So I'll try to draw connections to the presentations that came before me as much as possible. And I'd just also like to thank the organizers for inviting me here, and it's been so far a really educational and pleasurable experience. So let me get my screen shared and I'll just start. So now I think I should be able to. Okay. Does that show as a whole screen for everyone at this point? Okay, great. So yes, my presentation, I won't spend too much time introducing the translation here of Yu Jiao Li, that most people are well aware of its existence. It was translated in 1826 by Jean-Pierre Abel-Remusat, appears in a number of your papers, even if the name hasn't come up yet today in the presentation. I was particularly interested in reading Rick's paper and then listening to his presentation, because he was working with archival sources, and so was I, but from a totally different period, and finding them, they're not necessarily, some of them are archival, some of them are not, but sources that are a little bit hard to get your hands on until recently. So the internet has done wonderful things for our abilities to create these paratext or the surrounding circumstances for the what it is we're interested in studying. And we can talk about reception history. We can also talk about the different ways that books are marketed and what publishers are doing with things. I've had wonderful luck going through the Bibliothèque Nationale in France website and doing all sorts of variations on names and words and things like that to find all references to Abel-Remusat's translation of Yu Jiao Li, or Les Deux Cuisines. And these are just a few examples of the many journals that commented on, reviewed or parodied or advertised the novel in question. And then there's some archival sources too. So here's an example of, now they're coming to light more and more. Abel-Remusat's letters are appearing and they're available now. These are letters to Charles Weiss, one of his longtime friends, and reveal kind of interesting, intimate side to him. This is over here, his Moutadier was his publisher, and this is one of the advertisements that you find in totally random books. So this is a book in the front pages. It's a book on the history of France, and then this is the advertisement for the Yu Jiao Li translation at the front of it. This was from 1827, so just several months after it was published in 1826. you have to really look around and poke around and take some time to find this material. It's a lot of fun actually to do that. Working on this project, I have become extremely interested and almost a fan of Abel Rémusat. He had a very short life, tragically short life, 1788 to 1832. People say he might have died, poignantly of the cholera epidemic. We're all dealing with epidemics and pandemics, or he might have died of stomach cancer, or he might have died because his mother died before him and he was bereft. No one seems to be quite sure, but his life is fascinating, and how he learned Chinese and his personality and his wit and his intelligence come through in all of the things that he was writing, and the biographical sketches that are produced of him, and then the funeral and kind of pieces that were written, and the memorials that were written right in 1832, 1833 when he died. There were a number of famous scholars who died that year, and so there was a tragic year for French, especially Oriental studies. Most famously, Champollion, the decipherer of hieroglyphics, also died in this cholera epidemic in 1832. So this is a picture of him from 1821, and if you read my paper, you know that the first time that this novel comes to public awareness anyway was his translation of it was in 1822 when he read it at the foundational meeting of the Asiatic Society in France. And it's quite remarkable. I was kind of shocked or taken aback when you realize that this was considered the starring presentation, a reading from a novel at this event after de Saucy's oration on the efficacy and the reasons why people should be studying the Oriental languages. They were entertained with a novel. So I'm really interested in why that happened. And my paper goes into a little bit of that. And I'm also interested in why there was a long delay between the public reading and many mentions around that public reading that it was going to be published imminently, and the fact that it wasn't published till 1826. And this we can find in journal references. His friend Charles Weiss was visiting him in Paris, saw him writing, working on it, even had it read to him then privately aloud. So I'm interested in how that delay occurred. And it was because I'm pretty sure Abel Rémusat was uncertain of his translation. He was an autodidact. He learned Chinese, as we all know, via Manchu, and he was desperately looking for the Manchu translations, which he eventually found out were potentially in St. Petersburg. He wrote letters to St. Petersburg, and these letters survive now, and they're coming to light. So we know that he was trying to correct his, especially the verse parts of the translation that he was worried about. But I think he was generally worried about everything. He was uncertain about everything. I'm almost 100% certain that he never got to see the Manchu translation, because he was the kind of scholar who would have talked about it, and he does not talk about that in his preface. Julien, his student and then kind of critic later on, talks about extensively the fact that he used the Manchu translation, at least two of them, to translate his version, retranslation of Yu Jiaoli. And Julien's translation preface is interesting because he actually quotes extensively from the Manchu editions. He gives the transcriptions of the Manchu and the footnotes, and he actually critiques the Manchu. So he says, well, the Manchu translators were wrong at certain points, and my French translation is more accurate than what they were able to accomplish. But obviously, he was using it as a tool to work from. The interesting other directions that I didn't talk about. So other things that were going on in the literary cultural environment that shaped especially the preface. So in this long delay, Abel Rémusat did not just work on his translation. I think he developed his theory, his kind of comparative theory of the novel during that period of time. And the 1820s was this major, in France, there was a major influence by Walter Scott and his historical romances. And in 1826, just as the translation was published, Walter Scott was visiting France and causing a sensation. So the papers are simultaneously describing Walter Scott's activities in Paris and then reviewing the translation, Abou Moussa's translation. Another interesting angle is Abou Moussa's familiarity, in fact, deep familiarity with Jin Pingmei. You can tell from his preface, he never mentions the novel itself, but I'll show you a couple passages where it's clear that he's talking about Jin Pingmei. Another thing that is crucial to the reception and the understanding of the novel is the theme of polygamy. I go into my paper about Orientalism and the kind of feminization of the reader and the selling of the novel to a general audience, people of fashion, people who might find interest in the kind of romantic story or the frivolity of the text. And at the same time, there's an attempt to use the novel, and this has come up in Andrew's presentation too. There's something about getting a window on another culture, and the theme of polygamy certainly allows that. But it also allows Moussa to create this comparative context where he talks about, this novel is also often talked about in terms of its influence on Goethe. Goethe was reading in 1826, 1827, a variety of works by, in translation of Chinese works. And Abou Moussa's student, actually, Jean-Jacques Ampère, traveled to Weimar and met in the early months of 1827 with Goethe, and they discussed the Moussa's translation, Abou Moussa's translation. And so there's a record in Ampère's journals about these conversations. And the interesting thing about this is they're developing this theory of kind of world literature or comparative literature, but no one's really talked about the fact that Abou Moussa talks about Goethe in the preface to Yu Jiali, his version of Yu Jiali. And he mentions Goethe's play, Stella, which is a play in which the hero marries two people at the end of the novel. It was considered shocking at the time. It had to be revised in the 1820s, 1830s. It was revised and restaged, and it ends in suicide rather than polygamous happy ending with the hero marrying the two women. But there's very interesting discussion about, and then kind of revealing the fact that you can use the idea of polygamy as a novelist to think creatively about human sentiment and relationships. So this moves us into the fact that Abou Moussa was somewhat like maybe an early 19th century version of David Hawkes. He was extremely well-versed in the literature of the period. He read it backward and forward. It's clear from his other writings too. He was a wonderful stylist. If you read this translation, you really should read the French version. The English version is okay as a translation. I've been able to, this was forever it was considered just a anonymous relay translation, but I've been able to identify the author of that translation, and he's a member, a British author, a British person who was living in Paris at the time, and he consulted with Abou Moussa on the translation, so we know that he worked together with him. But it's just not as fun as the French translation does a much better job of just feeling like a wonderful novel. And the other thing that I would like to do is a close reading of chapter 1, because that's the chapter that's read out loud at the meeting, the first meeting. By the way, another student of Abou Moussa's read out loud, and from Hua Tu Yuan, the other Cai Zijiaren xiaoshuo that they were all reading and interested in, read it out loud at a subsequent meeting. I think it was an 1827 meeting of the Asiatic Society. So there was a lot of novel reading going on at these meetings. So I'll just skip through this quickly. I just want to show some passages where we can absolutely see that he's reading the text of Jin Pingmei and formulating his ideas about the novel and talking about it. So he knew that there was this 100-volume, that's probably 100 chapters, volume about a nouveau riche druggist. So this is obviously Xi Sing, and that he comes to have power because of his access to money. And that this, he shows, sets Xi Sing in the context of this complex social network and world. And there's a quotation in my paper that shows that Bramao-Ramos spoke about how reading a long novel like this, and I think he's specifically talking about Jinping, he was reading a long novel and he found it drudgery at the beginning, but by the end he had made so many intimate connections with the characters that he devoured the final volumes. He's not talking there about Yu Jiali. As much as he likes that, the Yu Jiali, I think it was the novel that he was allowed to translate because he couldn't translate. If he had had his choice, my theory is that he certainly would have translated Jinping, and it would have been wonderful if he had done that, because we would have this. He's a wonderful French stylist, and it would have been an absolute tour de force if he had been able to do that. But here he says, it's just impossible. We can't put this into our language. So instead, I'm going to read something that, although it's not rigorously moralistic, show that this passage tells us here, not, and it's still acceptable to people of taste in France in the 1820s. And that's despite the kind of frisson about the polygamous plot at the end, right? That still raises eyebrows, but nothing that would have been on the equivalent of what happens with Yu Jiali. So here's the polygamy plot and how he struggled with it. He was wondering how to do it, how in the world to explain this separation of a sentiment. And he talks about how this sentiment is so singular and particular, love, I guess he's really talking about, in his mind, how it could be parted or divided between two individuals. And then this is the line that he translates once in the preface one way, and then in the body of the text a different way. And in the body of the text, he doesn't put in many footnotes. This is an interesting point in Sarah's paper. She mentions Bramao-Ramos wasn't interested in really littering his text with footnotes. But at this one point, he feels like he needs to, right? He needs to talk about what this Liang Xin could possibly mean. And if you look at Julien's version of the same episode, they also—
About 4 minutes left, Daniel.
Okay. It also has a very long footnote on what being of two hearts could possibly mean, and how this, he's claiming that he's not of two hearts. How could he be possibly in love with both of these women in the same way romantically? I'm just going to close out by showing that another thing to consider when we're thinking about reading a close reading of the first chapter is what it means to read out loud, and how people were receiving this novel orally. They were listening to it. And so there are handbooks on how people should embody voices and characters and read scholarly papers and literary works out loud. So I'm kind of dipping into these sources and reading about them now. And then this is one of the people in the audience. I think also, so it's not just listening, it's also visualizing what the audience looked like. And this is Amédée David, one of the, we know, documented members of the audience who listened to the novel. And he's dressed in his academician's outfit. And this was from 1823. So right at the time when he would have been listening, this is exactly how he looked, maybe when he walked into the salon and listened to the novel. And we know that, could talk about masquerade and charlatanism and how the author is adopting a kind of Chinese persona, and he was perceived either brilliantly as being a Chinese novelist or as a fraud and a fake for having manufactured a Chinese novel. His publisher had to show in public the actual Chinese version of the text to dispel the perception that he had made the whole thing up and that he was a charlatan. And so then there's one of these other examples of a footnote that the few examples really telling. He talks about how, so I imagine this being read in front of all of these academicians, and they're seeing themselves. If you're familiar with the first chapter of Yu Jiali, you know it's all about these men of affairs and state gathering, and they're having a kind of fight about politics and things of that nature. They're drinking. The daughter comes in and writes a poem in place of her father. We can see he defines what a Hanlin scholar is in one of his footnotes. And he explicitly compares them to our academicians, and he talks about how much more honored they are in China and in Latin. He always jokes when he tries to joke most eruditely, he writes in Latin. So he says, well, scholars here are, or academicians are honored, but they're only honored once they're dead. But in China, they're honored all the time. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Daniel. Questions? Well, Daniel, I am interested in the generic dimension that you mentioned in your paper. Well, just now you made a very brief reference to Sir Walter Scott, right? But well, it is already scholarly consensus that the novel genre developed in France under the influence of translated novels from England during around briefly the period of time that you're talking about, you know, translations of like Samuel Richardson's novels, you know, like Pamela, Clarissa into French, and it is almost an established fact that the genre developed in France under foreign influence. So I don't know how you would look at the translation of Yu Jiaoli from this perspective and interest in a genre outside of France as having an influence on the possible development of this form in France, in the country.
Thanks, Leo, for the great question. So I mentioned also in the paper that Stendhal made this a kind of unusual claim. He said that translations from works like this from the Chinese are going to change the direction of literature in France. And at first that sounds kind of strange, right? Because there's this novel that no one really knows about now, unless you're a sinologist or someone like us who have always known about it, maybe. But the idea is here very explicit in the preface that he's trying to set what this novel is, if we call it a novel, Yu Jiaoli, his translation, in opposition to what Walter Scott does. So Walter Scott writes historical romances that are, in a sense, and especially in their imitated form, impoverished, because the people really are not observing their own lives. They're recreating the lives of people from the past. And that is a dead end for people like Stendhal and people of that generation, and also for Bramao-Ramos. They feel that what people need to do is they need to look at what's around them, the real world that they inhabit. And that's what this Chinese author does, according to Bramao-Ramos, right? And we actually know that that's not the case, that this novel was written in the 17th century. And Bramao-Ramos describes that in describing the 1400s. So it is itself a historical romance. So it's something that maybe Sarah was reading about, how China never changes. So it doesn't matter whether it's about wars that happened 1,000 years ago or right now. You can see, actually, maybe that's a weakness there. Bramao-Ramos was too smart for that. He didn't buy into that unchangingness of China too often, but he kind of is at this point. I think there are times when he lapses and he said, well, okay, I'll erase that distinction, and this is not a historical romance. So he tries to describe it as in opposition to the fad that established by the popularity of Walter Scott for historical romances. And this is exactly what you see in Stendhal's writings as well about that period, and how people are trying to push beyond it and get into more realism, or the observation, and writing about things that happened right then. So, you know, the black and the red, right about a few years in the past.
Thank you. Other questions? Rick?
Well, thanks, Danny. Really interesting presentation. I was really interested in one of the, probably the minor details, as you have mentioned, which is in the 1920s, they've changed the polygamous happy ending into a suicidal story. I was wondering, is that an isolated case, or is that pretty common? I mean, according to the socio-cultural norm of the target culture at that time?
I don't know whether I can answer that, Rick, directly. How often did, so it was Goethe himself who changed the ending. He rewrote the play in order to restage it. He wanted to restage it much later in his life. So it was, Stella was a work from his early period, and this was much nearing the end of his life. And he, I think, for whatever reason, I'm not a Goethe expert, but he wanted to see it on the stage again. And the way to get it on stage was to rewrite it as a tragedy. Now, there are all sorts of, I've done enough reading about the change in the ending to know that some people claim it's a kind of half-hearted solution to the problem, because he actually almost changed nothing in the text of the play until the very last moment, where the guy shoots himself instead of everyone saying they're going to marry him. So it's a very strange, I think it's unique and strange in that sense. It's one of these things that, as far as I can tell, I've tried to find as much scholarship as I can on Stella. It's not one of the plays that it's considered a minor play, so not too many people write about it in extensive ways, but it's a really wonderful, actually it's a wonderful play and fascinating. There have been some recent restagings, and I've been watching them on YouTube. They're quite affecting. Good play.
Thank you.
May I? Okay, what's the turn to get a chance to speak, or just push the button? Okay.
I don't know if I'm moderating or Leo is.
There's no moderator? Okay, then
I don't know.
Yeah, well, jump in. The moderator probably is now having lunch. Okay, and well, and I'm outsider to this translation business, and nor have done any significant work about East-West interaction, culture or literary. And so as a result, I've learned a great deal from your presentation, and it's quite enlightening to me. But also I think I have an advantage, because I am not deeply involved in any of those projects. Then I can raise some questions probably that may be useful for our effort to put all the papers together as a coherent volume. First of all, I find that most of you, I think all your papers are very solid paper grounded in really a lot of solid empirical work. So they are all very excellent case studies. If we publish the book in Chinese or the Chinese version, I do not see any problem, because it contains a lot of new material surrounding the conception, the production, and the reception of the different Chinese master texts, as well as the impact on the on the translator's world. But as an English volume, I think probably our academia's expectations are a little different, because of the current academic climate, is that they ask for theoretical questions. What your study raise about our general understanding of literature and cross-cultural relationship. So I think probably we need to work a little bit on that side by talking to each other on some key topics, key issues. And then that will give a sense of coherence for the whole project. So in addition to presenting the readers without findings, archival findings, finding of interesting unknown historical facts, but we also make a theoretical contribution to the study. So listening to your presentation, I came up with two possible paradigm for establishing links, forging link between our papers. First is the dynamics of reception. I think quite a few of your papers deal with the dynamics of what I call the dynamic reception. The reception is not passive. and it is, permeate the entire process of translation. For example, or even before the translation, Andrews talk about how the frame, the paratext, the preface of Jinping Mei, prepare the reader. That's kind of expecting the reception. It's the author very consciously anticipating the reception and then to try to manage the reception in the way he wants. So that's the authorly reception. And then Rick's paper deals with archival. So this is the anticipation or anxiety about reception by the agent of publishing. Because there's the factor, whether or not they produce a profit, they will appeal to the audience, and those who reject are the ones who fear the reception, and those who embrace. So you can see how the reception factor really shape the decision, shape determine the fate of many translation and projects. So this, we could, and then also about Antonius' paper, about the choice of title and thing, and the Feng Bonglong's paper, all has to do with their expectation how the book will be received in the West and at different point of historical periods. So I do not know, whether or not we can use this, as a mechanism of thought or conceptual or technical, whatever you call it, try to, put this paper as a cluster. At least I think we as editors, we need to think about that. At least we do this kind of spin, on it. But I think there's intrinsically the link, on this conceptual issue of reception. And I think we can make a claim that the reception is more dynamic and is more productive. It's not passive. Then we use your discovery to prove that point. So this is one thing. Then another topic is still, but probably help to tie the other few papers together, is the issue of the translator's knowledge of Chinese. Is it an advantage or disadvantage? And then how would you compare with the famous translation of Israel Pang of Chinese poetry, someone who have no knowledge, but is billed as the very unfaithful great translation, and also some of the academic translation can be faithful but very boring. But is there a middle ground? And I think the David Hawkes really achieved that set a new benchmark. And how the knowledge of the native tradition, the deep knowledge, is not constitute a kind of a barrier to excellent translation, and how did he manage to do that? And there was other papers about the Sarah's paper, Daniel's paper, all touch upon that issue, and then how this academic translation and have the impact, and also intervene the literary trend at that time, like the translators. How to take on the Walter Scott tradition and use the Chinese tradition as that. That could be, another. That's what I think. That could be a kind of a framework to establish the relationship, the ties between your presentation. So these are the issues. Leo, we have to think about. We all have things. And of course, when you're revising your paper, it would be nice if we can agree upon some of the things we can talk to each other, some of the issues we can address, different angles, and Okay, these are just some very immature, thoughts to share with you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I would also consider those as concluding remarks, right, Zhongqi?
No, I do not mean to say I'm more concerned about how to, again, how to manage our reception of our voice.
Yes.
Yeah, we have to anticipate and how to do it together in a way, in a successful way. Yeah.
Yes. Well, actually, I would be calling on you to say something at the end. So it's good that you've come up with these remarks. And I think they're very pertinent if this collected volume is going to make a splash. All right, and
well,
it's not just a collection.
Impact. I will not dare to have that great expectation.
Okay. But a lot of the topics covered by our presenters have not been touched upon. So it's not impossible that it could generate interest in this area.
Oh, then I trust your expert's opinion. I'm an outsider's opinion. Yeah.
But I also noticed one thing, and that is many of our participants have not been able to raise questions, maybe because they were still thinking about what questions to raise. So I'd like to suggest that you send your comments to each other. I mean, if you have thoughts that came to you after this symposium, and then this group can share ideas since you have each other's emails. And so if you had not had the chance to voice your views just now, you could still write to the authors of these papers, and then kind of making it possible for us to kind of move each other along and improve each other's work. So that's one thing I just came to think of. So you all have each other's emails. So and that is one purpose, to be served by this directory. I do not have anything special to add to what Professor Tsai has said. Do others have any comments?
Okay, just call me Zhongqi. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I use both forms of address anyway. So any thing you want to bring up at this point while we are together?
I just one more suggestion. If possible, could you people try to attend the next section B? So it's really, it's really not that good for us to split into two sections, because we need to really transcend the artificial boundary of two sessions when we group the papers together thematically. And I don't think it's a good idea just to split the paper along the genre. It's better to arrange the paper according to different kind of topics, theoretically significant topics. And then each topic will cover different genre. That would be probably more productive. So if possible, I know it's very tough. I do not know what time will be in America tonight. When we're doing
it's already midnight, I think, past midnight in
then
New York, and on the East Coast.
Okay, then I will.
Yeah, so we really
my suggestion. Okay, I will show myself. That's really too much. Okay.
Yes, and some of them may want to take some sleep before waking up for the next session, which takes place early in the morning. That's April the 11th for them. So can I just join this meeting and then wish everybody good luck. And I hope to hear from you, and then you should also look forward to hearing from each other too. We'll meet then, well, about, let me see, about
9 o'clock.
This is 8 o'clock here. So about 9 o'clock Hong Kong time tonight. So we'll meet again, I hope, 13 hours from now. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.